Hey guys, tonight we begin with the desperately unlucky, religiously doomed, and physically excruciating life of the ancient Egyptian tomb robber. You've seen them in movies, swinging dramatically over pits of snakes, outsmarting booby traps with a rakish smile. But trust me, actual tomb robbing was nothing like Indiana Jones. It was terrifying, desperate work that usually ended with impalement rather than tenure. Picture this. You're crawling through a pitch-black tunnel. The air is thick with 3,000-year-old dust. Your torch flickers, threatening to plunge you into complete darkness. But darkness is actually the least of your worries. The smell hits you first. That distinctive aroma of ancient death, chemicals, and bandages that no amount of showering will ever wash away. You're literally breathing in particles of mummified pharaoh. Congratulations. That's probably the closest you'll ever get to royalty. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining my late-night historical nightmare fuel sessions. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum that drowns out the imaginary sounds of ancient curses. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You were born into the scorching Egyptian desert, not with royal blood or priestly connections. No golden throne or respected position awaited you, just the burning sun above and whispered secrets about where the dead sleep with their riches. Your family tree contains 0 pharaohs, but plenty of calloused hands and empty stomachs. Therefore, when famine strikes harder than usual, you find yourself considering the unthinkable. You know those massive monuments dotting the landscape? They're not just architectural flexing by dead kings. They're stuffed with treasure, gold masks, jeweled amulets, precious stones. All that wealth just sitting there, doing nothing for nobody. Meanwhile, your little sister hasn't eaten in 2 days. The math seems simple, but there's a catch. A terrifying, soul-destroying, possibly eternity-ruining catch. Those tombs aren't just storage units for royal leftovers. They're sacred gateways to the afterlife. Disturbing them doesn't just break the law, it breaks cosmic order itself. Therefore, you're not just risking execution, though that's definitely on the table. You're risking divine retribution that follows you beyond death. Sleep becomes a luxury you can't afford. Every shadow might be a guard. Every cough could be the first symptom of a mummy's curse. Every creak in your mud brick home might be officials coming to collect your nose and ears. The standard punishment for minor theft, by the way. Major theft. That's when they get creative with hot pokers and impalement stakes. Your tools are pathetic. A copper chisel that dulls after 10 minutes. A flimsy reed torch that threatens to go out with every breath of stale tomb air. And maybe if you're fancy, a sad little wooden mallet that's one good swing away from splintering. The modern equivalent would be robbing Fort Knox with a plastic spoon and a Zippo lighter. And let's talk about your work environment. Modern jobs have OSHA regulations. You have angry spirits, deadly traps, and the constant possibility of being buried alive when poorly constructed tunnels collapse. Your workplace hazards include poison, architectural assassination attempts, and the occasional scorpion that's made a cozy home in a pharaoh's eye socket. But the worst part isn't the danger, or even the gruesome execution waiting if you're caught. It's the psychological horror. Hours in suffocating darkness, surrounded by the dead, committing the most taboo act in your culture. Your ancestors watch disapprovingly from the afterlife. The gods track your sacrilege. The weight of thousands of years of religious conditioning crashes down on you with every stolen trinket. And for what? Most tomb robbers remained desperately poor. That golden scarab you risked everything for, you'll sell it for a fraction of its worth to a shady middleman who knows exactly how desperate you are. You can't exactly advertise your new inventory on the village market stall between the dates and donkey saddles. That's the cruel irony of it all. Those magnificent tombs weren't built to protect the dead from the living. They were built to maintain the same brutal inequality in death that existed in life. The pharaohs who fed you lies about divine order didn't want you touching their stuff in the afterlife. any more than they wanted you sitting on their throne in this one. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep in your comfortable bed, remember those desperate souls who crawled through darkness, terrified but determined, breaking cosmic law just to feed their families. Because in the end, it wasn't curses that emptied Egypt's tombs. It was human desperation colliding with obscene inequality. And that might be the real curse, one that has followed humanity through every age and civilization since. Nobody wakes up one morning and thinks, you know what would be a fun career? Desecrating the sacred resting places of my culture's most revered figures. Tomb robbing wasn't a childhood dream or an aspiration. It was the last desperate gamble of the truly desperate. In the shadow of those magnificent pyramids and hidden valley tombs lived people the hieroglyphs rarely mentioned. The farmers whose harvests failed 3 years running. The laborers crippled by accidents on royal building projects. The widows whose husbands died building some pharaoh's eternal mansion. The forgotten ones crushed beneath the weight of Egypt's rigid social hierarchy. Ancient Egypt wasn't just divided between rich and poor. It was stratified with divine precision. At the top sat the god-king Pharaoh, literally considered a deity walking among mortals. Below him, the elite priests who controlled religious life and, conveniently, massive temple wealth. Then came the nobles, scribes, artisans, and soldiers. And at the bottom, the peasants and slaves who made up over 80% of the population. For them, life was backbreaking labor under the scorching Egyptian sun. Your day began before dawn, hauling water, tending fields, building monuments to rulers you'd never meet. Your reward? Just enough food to keep working another day. Your retirement plan? Die before your body completely breaks down. Your healthcare? Pray the local healer knows which herbs might help. But surely there was social mobility, I hear you ask. That's adorable. The son of a farmer became a farmer. The daughter of a servant became a servant. Your place was determined at birth with the rigid certainty of religious doctrine. The official explanation? The gods ordained this perfect social order. Questioning it wasn't just socially inappropriate, it was cosmic blasphemy. Then came the inevitable crisis. Maybe it was drought turning the life-giving Nile into a trickle. Perhaps it was locusts devouring what little crop you managed to grow. Or maybe it was the tax collector demanding grain you didn't have because the previous tax collector already took it. Ancient Egyptian tax collectors weren't known for their understanding nature or flexible payment plans. Hunger changes people. Not the I skipped lunch hunger. The my children's ribs are showing and they've stopped crying because they don't have the energy hunger. That kind of hunger makes previously unthinkable options suddenly seem worth considering. And there they were, the tombs. Monuments to excess in a landscape of desperate need. Everyone knew what they contained. Golden masks, jewelry, precious stones, fine linens, alabaster jars filled with oils and perfumes worth a fortune. Enough wealth to feed your family for years, all buried with a corpse who definitely wasn't using it anymore. But between you and that salvation stood the most powerful barrier in Egyptian society. Not guards or walls, but sacred belief. The Egyptians didn't just respect their dead. They built their entire culture around death preparation. The afterlife wasn't a vague concept. It was a concrete destination requiring specific equipment, which is exactly why tombs were filled with valuables. Disturbing a tomb meant interfering with someone's eternal journey. It wasn't just theft, it was spiritual murder. You weren't just taking objects, you were potentially destroying someone's immortal soul. In a society where religion wasn't a Sunday activity but the very fabric of existence, this was an almost unimaginable taboo. Your own parents and grandparents had taught you to fear and respect these sacred spaces. The bedtime stories of your childhood weren't about monsters under the bed, but about the terrible fate awaiting those who disturbed the dead. Your entire community would view the act as worse than murder. At least murderers only killed the body. Tomb robbers threatened eternal existence. So when did someone cross that line? When did the desperate need of the living outweigh the sacred rights of the dead? Picture this. Your youngest child hasn't eaten in 3 days. Their eyes are sunken, their limbs like twigs. Your spouse has been giving their portion to the children, growing weaker by the day. You've sold everything of value. You've begged. You've even considered selling yourself into servitude, but no one's buying in these hard times. Then you remember. Your grandfather once worked on a tomb in the Western Hills. Before he died, delirious with fever, he mentioned a small entrance, a hidden shaft, a place the overseers had sealed hastily during construction. Information passed down in whispers over drinks, a dangerous secret shared between trusted friends. The first time you walk past that hillside, you tell yourself you're just curious. The second time, you start noticing landmarks your grandfather described. By the third visit, you're carrying a small copper chisel hidden in your clothing. You're not going to use it, of course. You're just prepared, just in case. The decision is never made all at once. It's 1,000 tiny decisions. Walking closer to the tombs, touching the sealed entrance, testing the stone, coming back with better tools. Each step small enough to let you pretend you haven't actually decided yet. You're just keeping options open. You haven't crossed any lines. You could still turn back. Until the moment you can't. The moment your chisel strikes stone with purpose rather than curiosity. The sound echoes not just in the valley but in your soul. There's no going back now. You've done the unthinkable. You've chosen the living over the dead, the practical over the sacred, your family's survival over your culture's deepest taboos. The choice feels both terrible and liberating. Terror at what spiritual retribution might follow. Relief that you're finally doing something, anything to save your family. The contradiction tears at you as your chisel chips away at ancient mortar. For some, that first breach came from pure survival. For others, it began with debt, an amount impossible to repay through honest labor. In a society where debt could lead to your entire family being enslaved, desperate measures seemed almost reasonable. After all, what's worse? Stealing from the dead, or watching your children become property? Some were social outcasts already, people with nothing left to lose. The disfigured, the diseased, those accused of other crimes, foreigners without community protection. When society has already rejected you, its taboos hold less power. A few were even former tomb workers themselves. The bitter irony of spending your life building elaborate resting places for the obscenely wealthy, only to return home to a hungry family in a mud hut. These workers knew the secrets, the layout, the false passages, the real treasures hidden behind distractions. Their knowledge made them both valuable accomplices and particularly sacrilegious traitors. The most desperate typically acted alone at first. A quick, terrified grab for whatever could be easily carried and quickly sold. But successful tomb robbing eventually required planning, tools, and most dangerously, accomplices. Individual desperation evolved into criminal networks spanning from the necropolises to the markets, involving diggers, lookouts, transporters, fences, and corrupt officials. What began as a starving parent's last resort became, for some, an alternative economy. Still driven by inequality, still born of desperation, but organized, calculated, and surprisingly sophisticated. Some tomb robbing operations spanned generations, with techniques and tomb locations passed from father to son as a twisted family trade. But never forget, at its root was always desperation. The kind of desperation that makes a person willingly damn their immortal soul. The kind that makes them brave punishment that would make modern torture look like a spa treatment. The kind that forces them to choose between sacred law and survival. So before you judge the tomb robber too harshly, ask yourself, what would it take for you to cross your own society's ultimate taboo? How hungry would your children need to be? How hopeless would your situation have to become? Because that's the final, uncomfortable truth about tomb robbing. It wasn't a failure of morality or religion. It was a failure of society. A system so unequal that people would risk eternal damnation rather than watch their children starve in the shadow of golden monuments to the already privileged dead. That first chip of stone falling away from a tomb entrance might seem like a small thing, just a bit of rock, really. But in ancient Egypt, that tiny act shattered something far greater than limestone. It broke Ma'at, the divine order of the universe itself. To understand why tomb robbing wasn't just frowned upon but considered a cosmic crime worthy of the most horrific punishments imaginable, we need to dive into the Egyptian worldview. And let me tell you, these people took their afterlife seriously. Like, build massive pyramids and dedicate your entire economy to death seriously. For Egyptians, death wasn't an ending, but a transition. The tomb wasn't a grave. It was a gateway, a launching pad to eternity. The deceased needed their body preserved and their tomb fully stocked because they would literally use these things in the afterlife. That golden mask wasn't just decorative bling. It was functional equipment for navigating the field of reeds, their version of paradise. The Egyptians believed in several parts of the soul: the Ba, personality; the Ka, life force; the Ak, transformed self, and others. These spiritual components needed to reunite with the preserved body periodically. If the body was destroyed or the tomb's contents stolen, this cosmic reunion became impossible. By robbing a tomb, you weren't just taking objects, you were potentially annihilating someone's eternal existence. Imagine believing that your actions could not just kill someone, but erase them from reality forever. That's the weight that rested on every tomb robber's conscience. No wonder many broke down psychologically, convinced that jackal-headed Anubis was following them home. The religious horror was reinforced by legal consequences that would make modern prison look like a luxury resort. The pharaoh, as living god and keeper of Ma'at, had a sacred duty to protect the dead. Breaking into a royal tomb wasn't just theft, it was an attack on the divine order, a personal offense against the gods, and a direct challenge to pharaonic authority. For such a crime, ordinary punishment wouldn't do. Egyptian justice needed to be spectacular, both as retribution and as a deterrent. And spectacular it was, in the most nightmarish way possible. The standard punishment for tomb robbing was impalement. Not the quick, relatively merciful impalement you might be imagining. This was a specialized torture designed to maximize suffering and public visibility. The condemned would be skewered on a sharpened wooden stake, carefully positioned to avoid vital organs. The stake would be planted upright in a public place, leaving the victim to die slowly, sometimes taking days in excruciating agony, exposed to the elements and public ridicule. If that sounds merciful compared to modern execution methods, consider that the goal wasn't quick death, but prolonged suffering. No anesthesia, no last meal, no blindfold, just slow public agony as your body weight gradually pulled you further down the stake. For those caught desecrating royal tombs, the punishment might include preliminary torture. Beatings, mutilation, and burning preceded the final execution. Some tomb robbers had their noses and ears cut off before impalement, a permanent mark of their crime for everyone to see in the afterlife. In some cases, entire families were punished for the crimes of one member. Your desperate gamble to feed your children could result in those same children facing execution or slavery. The message was clear: nothing, not even your family's survival, justified disturbing the dead. These weren't empty threats. The historical record contains numerous accounts of tomb robber trials and punishments. The Abbott Papyrus and the Amherst Papyrus document a series of tomb robbery investigations during the 20th dynasty. These records detail not just the crimes, but the tortures used to extract confessions and the gruesome executions that followed. One particularly detailed account describes a group of 8 tomb robbers who broke into several tombs in the Valley of the Kings. After capture and torture, they confessed and led officials to their hidden loot. Their punishment: 7 were impaled. The 8th, possibly a minor accomplice, had his nose and ears removed before being sent to labor in the mines, a punishment considered a slow death sentence of its own. But the physical punishment, however terrible, was just the beginning. The Egyptians believed that those who died bad deaths or remained unburied faced a worse fate in the afterlife. Tomb robbers, executed and often denied proper burial themselves, were condemned to a double death, destruction in this world and the next. The ultimate Egyptian nightmare was to be forgotten, to have no one speak your name or make offerings at your tomb. Executed criminals were often denied tombs altogether, their bodies discarded in the desert or thrown into the Nile. No preservation, no funeral texts, no offerings, just complete erasure from both physical and spiritual existence. Beyond these earthly and afterlife punishments lurked something perhaps even more terrifying: the curse. Tomb curses weren't just Hollywood inventions. Real ancient Egyptian tombs contained warning inscriptions threatening supernatural retribution against those who disturb the dead. A typical curse might read, "As for anyone who enters this tomb impurely, I shall seize him like a bird. I shall cast the fear of myself into him." Others were more specific. "Their years shall be shortened, their food, water, and air shall be taken, and a violent death shall be their fate." These weren't empty threats to the Egyptian mind. They believed words carved in stone had real power. Hieroglyphs weren't just symbols, but living, magical entities capable of manifesting what they described. The curse wasn't just written, it was activated by the very act of reading it. For the tomb robber who could actually read hieroglyphs, a rare skill, seeing such a curse must have been terrifying. For those who couldn't read, the stories circulating about cursed thieves suffering mysterious ailments, accidents, and madness were equally effective. Every cough, every fever, every nightmare after robbing a tomb would be interpreted as the curse taking effect. Even if you somehow escaped human justice, you still had to face the judgment of the gods. In Egyptian belief, after death, your heart would be weighed against the feather of Mayat, truth and order, by Anubis. Those whose hearts were heavier than the feather, weighed down by sins like tomb robbing, would be consumed by Amit, the soul-eating chimera, resulting in complete annihilation. And yet, despite these horrifying physical, psychological, and spiritual consequences, tomb robbing continued throughout Egyptian history. Sometimes openly during periods of civil unrest, sometimes secretly during stable reigns, but always persistently. The treasures were simply too tempting, the inequality too stark, the hunger too real. The truly desperate reached a terrible calculus. Better to risk eternal damnation than watch your family starve in the present. Better to gamble with your afterlife than lose the only life you were certain of. In the mind of a parent watching their child waste away, even impalement might seem worth the chance of bringing home gold that could buy food. Some tomb robbers sought psychological protection through rituals and superstitions of their own. They would recite counterspells, carry protective amulets, or make small offerings before entering a tomb. Bizarre attempts to spiritually offset their sacrilege even as they committed it. "Forgive me, Great One, but my children are hungry," they might whisper while prying open a coffin. Others dissociated completely, numbing themselves to the religious implications of their actions. They focused only on the material reality, stones, passages, treasures, and suppressed any thought of what these objects truly meant in Egyptian cosmology. Some drank heavily before entering tombs, using liquid courage to silence their cultural conditioning. The most successful tomb robbers developed an alternative moral framework. They weren't violating sacred space. They were redistributing hoarded wealth. They weren't damning souls. They were saving lives. Some even believed they were fulfilling a cosmic balance. For what god would value gold over children's lives? Wasn't allowing a child to starve while treasures sat unused in tombs the real violation of Maat? By the late periods of Egyptian history, tomb robbing had become so common that many officials were complicit. Guards could be bribed, inspectors paid off, priests convinced to look the other way. The system that had once projected absolute divine authority revealed itself to be as corruptible as any human institution. But never mistake this pragmatism for safety. Even at the height of corruption and tomb robbing, those caught without powerful protectors faced the stake, the knife. and the supernatural consequences that terrified Egyptians more than any physical pain. So the next time you casually stroll through a museum exhibit of Egyptian artifacts, remember, many of those beautiful objects passed through the trembling hands of people who believed they were damning their immortal souls by touching them. People who risked having their noses cut off, their bodies impaled, and their spirits erased from existence. All for a chance to survive one more season in the shadow of the pyramids, built by kings who claimed divinity while their subjects starved. So you've decided to risk eternal damnation, horrific execution, and the wrath of ancient gods to feed your family. Congratulations on making the most desperate career choice in ancient Egypt. Now comes the hard part, figuring out how to actually do it without ending up impaled in the village square by sundown. Unlike basket weaving or farming, tomb robbing wasn't exactly taught at the local vocational school. There were no helpful scrolls titled "Tomb Robbing for Beginners" or 10 Easy Steps to Desecrate the Dead. This was forbidden knowledge, whispered in shadows, passed through nervous glances and cryptic phrases. The first challenge wasn't just learning how, it was finding someone willing to teach you. For many, the entry point came through legitimate work. Construction laborers who had helped build tombs possessed invaluable inside knowledge. Embalmers' assistants knew about burial practices and tomb layouts. Even guards, when desperate enough, might share secrets about patrol schedules or unguarded entrances. In a society where jobs were hereditary, this information often stayed within families, passed quietly from father to son or uncle to nephew like a dark inheritance. My grandfather worked on the Western tombs, someone might murmur over beer, said they sealed the hidden chamber in a hurry, never finished the protective inscriptions. It wasn't an explicit invitation to rob the place, but among the desperately poor, the subtext was clear. Information was a commodity more precious than gold, because it was the map to gold. Some knowledge could be gathered through observation. Which tombs had active cult priests still making offerings? Which had been abandoned for generations? Where did guards patrol, and how frequently? Did certain tombs flood during the inundation season? A potential tomb robber might spend months just watching, memorizing, planning, because the difference between success and impalement was often in these details. The real education came from joining an existing operation. No one went from law-abiding citizen to successful tomb robber overnight. You started small, perhaps as a lookout positioned at the edge of the necropolis, signaling when officials approached. Or maybe as a runner, carrying stolen goods from the tomb entrance to a hidden cache. Each role was a step in your forbidden apprenticeship, each success earning you slightly more trust and knowledge. These criminal networks operated with surprising sophistication. Court records from the late Ramesside period describe organized gangs with specialized roles, diggers with knowledge of tomb architecture, scouts who identified promising targets, transporters who moved goods, and fences who sold stolen items through complex distribution networks. These weren't just random thieves. They were structured organizations with their own hierarchy and expertise. Learning the signs and symbols of the trade was crucial. Tomb robbers developed their own coded language, subtle marks scratched near promising tombs and secret meeting places. A series of small notches on a cliff face might indicate a previously looted tomb. No need to risk your life for an empty chamber. A particular pattern of stones might signal guards patrol here regularly or safe path this way. It was a thief's language written in the desert itself. Physical skills were equally important. How to break through stone without causing a collapse. How to navigate narrow, pitch-black passages without getting lost. How to identify valuable items quickly in the darkness. How to tell real gold from gilded wood at a glance. How to move silently, breathe in dust-filled chambers, and work in spaces so confined a wrong move could mean being trapped forever. The first rule every novice learned: never go alone. Tombs were architectural marvels designed with religious symbolism and practical function, but not safety standards. Passages collapsed. Air grew thin in deep chambers. Getting lost in a labyrinthine royal tomb could mean slow suffocation or starvation. A partner could pull you out if something fell, find help if you were injured, or at least report where your body lay so your family might recover it. The second rule: bring the right tools, but nothing you can't explain away if caught en route. A farmer's small copper chisel could be for work in the fields or for prying open a sealed doorway. Oil lamps were common household items that also illuminated tomb corridors. Rope had 1,000 innocent uses besides lowering yourself into burial shafts. The best tomb robbers used ordinary tools in extraordinary ways, because carrying specialized equipment meant carrying evidence. The third rule, perhaps most important: know when to run. Guards changed shifts. Officials made surprise inspections. Other tomb robbers might be working the same area and raise an alarm. Learning to recognize the signs of danger, unusual movement near temple complexes, unexpected torchlight, the distant sound of marching feet, could mean the difference between escape and execution. Your first expedition would be terrifying, disorienting, and likely disappointing. The experienced thief who brought you would assign the simplest, safest tasks: holding a lamp, watching an entrance, carrying small items. You'd be told little about the overall operation, because if caught, you couldn't reveal what you didn't know. This compartmentalization protected everyone involved. The darkness inside a tomb was unlike any darkness you'd experienced. Not the gentle night darkness relieved by stars and moon, but an absolute crushing black that swallowed light like a living thing. The air was ancient, undisturbed for decades or centuries, thick with dust and the chemicals used in mummification. The silence was profound, broken only by your panicked breathing and the soft scrape of tools against stone. And then there were the occupants. Nothing prepared you for your first face-to-face encounter with a mummy. Even in darkness, knowing they were there, sometimes dozens of them, watching your sacrilege with empty eye sockets and wrapped limbs. Every unexpected sound became a mummy stirring to life. Every shadow became a guardian spirit moving to protect its master. Most first-timers panicked. They froze, fled, or became physically ill. The veterans expected this. It was part of the initiation. Those who couldn't overcome their terror weren't suited for the work. The psychological barrier was often more effective than any physical trap or guard. If you persevered, your education continued. You learned that noble tombs often contained maps of their own layout painted on walls, helpful guides for the deceased in the afterlife, and equally helpful for robbers. You discovered that tomb markers visible above ground often had specific relationships to the burial chambers below. You realized that even sealed tombs usually had alternative entrances created by builders for their own access during construction. The most valuable lessons were about reading the tomb itself. Undisturbed sand or debris meant you were the first to enter since sealing. Scattered pottery fragments or disturbed burial goods meant previous robbers had already taken the best items. Fresh air flowing through a passage indicated another exit, or that someone else had recently opened the tomb. These environmental clues kept the observant alive. As your skills developed, you learned the cruel economic reality of your new profession. That golden amulet that might have adorned a pharaoh's neck, you'd sell it for a fraction of its true value to a fence who knew exactly how desperate you were. The exquisite jeweled collar that took artisans months to create, it would likely be melted down immediately, the craftsmanship destroyed to make the gold untraceable. What represented life-changing wealth in theory yielded only temporary relief in practice. Building a network of contacts became essential. You needed someone to sell your stolen goods, usually a corrupt merchant or traveling trader from outside your village. You needed informants who could warn of planned tomb inspections. You might even cultivate relationships with low-level officials willing to look the other way for a share of the profits. The most successful tomb robbers weren't necessarily the strongest or most daring. They were the ones who built the best networks. The knowledge itself became a burden. Every time you passed a tomb, you now saw it differently, not as a sacred space, but as a potential target, with vulnerabilities your trained eye could identify. You noticed details others missed. The slight discoloration of rock indicating a hidden entrance. The pattern of erosion suggesting a weak point in the structure. This perception marked you as surely as any physical brand. You saw the world through a thief's eyes now, and there was no going back. For some, the training never took. They participated in one expedition and then retreated to legitimate poverty, haunted by the experience, but alive. Others discovered they had a terrible talent for the work, the steady hands, spatial memory, and emotional detachment required to succeed in this darkest of professions. A few even found a twisted pride in their skills, the same pride any craftsman feels in becoming expert at their trade, even when that trade involved desecration. Most fell somewhere in between, competent enough to participate, but always terrified, always one nightmare away from abandoning the work altogether. They murmured prayers even as they stole, made small offerings to appease the gods, even as they violated their laws. The contradiction tore at them, but hunger was a more immediate master than spiritual consistency. There was no graduation ceremony, no moment when your training officially ended. One day you simply realized you were guiding others, teaching them the signs, showing them how to break a seal without evidence, how to navigate by touch in absolute darkness. You had become what you once feared, a master of forbidden knowledge, a desecrator with skilled hands, a thief who moved between worlds. And each night, whether successful or empty-handed, you returned home to wash the ancient dust from your skin, to hide your small treasures, to lie to your family about where you'd been. Just helping with the harvest, you might say, as your children ate their first proper meal in weeks. The skill you practiced most frequently wasn't tomb-breaking at all. It was living with what you had become. The knowledge in your head might mark you as a tomb robber, but it was the tools in your hands that would either save your life or end it. Forget the Hollywood image of treasure hunters with specialized gadgets and convenient torches that never go out. Real tomb robbers worked with implements so primitive and inadequate that using them in a modern construction job would get you laughed off the site, right before you were fired for safety violations. Your toolkit began with what you could scavenge, borrow, or repurpose without raising suspicion. The copper chisel that you claimed was for woodworking, the small hammer supposedly for household repairs, the oil lamp that everyone owned but few brought into ancient burial chambers filled with flammable wrappings and bone-dry wood. Each item innocent on its own, each potentially deadly in the wrong circumstances. Let's start with your primary enemy inside a tomb. Absolute darkness. The kind of darkness where your eyes never adjust because there's nothing to adjust to. A darkness so complete it feels like a physical presence pressing against your skin. Your solution: pathetically inadequate lighting that was just as likely to kill you as help you. Oil lamps were the standard illumination, small clay dishes with a wick floating in olive or castor oil. They provided about as much light as a birthday candle, with a flame that flickered wildly at the slightest movement or breath. The fuel lasted maybe 2 hours if you were lucky. And here's the fun part. You were working in confined spaces, often filled with flammable materials. One wrong move, and you'd set fire to ancient linens, wooden coffins, or your own clothing. More cautious robbers used slow-burning reeds or twisted papyrus stems soaked in wax or oil. These created less light than a lamp, but were less likely to cause a conflagration. The trade-off? You could barely see your hand in front of your face. Imagine trying to identify valuable items in a storeroom when you can only illuminate a few inches at a time. That golden statue might be right next to you, but if your light doesn't hit it just right, you'd miss it entirely. Then, there was the problem of carrying your light source while also using tools and carrying stolen goods. You needed one hand for the lamp, one for your chisel, and one for your bag of loot. Unfortunately, evolution had cruelly limited you to just 2 hands. Some robbers fashioned crude headgear to hold their lamps, resulting in singed hair and oil dripping onto their faces. Others worked in pairs, one holding the light while the other worked, doubling the risk of detection and halving the potential profit. Now for the tools that would get you past barriers. Ancient Egyptians sealed tombs with stone blocks, rubble-filled corridors, false walls, and hidden entrances. Your primary tool against these obstacles? A copper chisel that would bend after a few solid strikes against limestone. Copper was relatively soft, great for not creating sparks in a potentially methane-filled tomb, terrible for actually cutting through hard stone. Your hammer might be nothing more than a rounded riverstone, wrapped in leather if you were fancy. It shattered limestone adequately, but lacked precision. One too powerful strike could bring down more of the ceiling than you intended. Many tomb robbers died beneath cave-ins they themselves caused with overzealous hammering. For more delicate work, like extracting a jewel from a setting or separating gold leaf from wood, you might use a slim bone awl or a small wooden tool with a copper tip. These were so fragile they often broke during use, leaving you to continue with your fingers or abandon the effort entirely. Ropes were essential but problematic. Made from twisted papyrus or palm fiber, they frayed easily, weakened when wet, from sweat or damp tomb conditions, and regularly broke under strain. Yet, you needed them to lower yourself into vertical burial shafts, to haul up heavy items, to feel your way back through dark passages by following a lifeline tied at the entrance. A rope breaking while you were suspended over a 30-foot shaft was a particularly unpleasant way to end your career. The bag for your stolen goods presented another challenge. It needed to be large enough to carry valuable items, but small enough to conceal under clothing when coming and going. Too noisy, and it would echo in the tomb's silence. Too flimsy, and it would tear under the weight of metal treasures. Most used simple linen sacks, the same kind used for grain or household items. Another example of repurposing innocent objects for criminal use. Some tombs, particularly royal ones, were designed with traps or barriers, requiring specialized tools to bypass. Water-filled channels needed to be crossed or drained. Sliding stone blocks had to be propped open. Sand-filled chambers had to be navigated without triggering collapsing floors. For these, you'd improvise with wooden poles, small leather buckets, or whatever you could carry inconspicuously to the site. The physical toll of using these inadequate tools was immediate and severe. Copper chisels transferred the shock of each hammer blow directly into your wrist and arm. After an hour of pounding, your hands would be numb, your joints screaming in protest. The day after a tomb expedition, you'd struggle to grip a water pot or hold your child, a telltale sign of your nighttime activities that you'd attribute to hard work in the fields. Working in awkward positions, crouched in low tunnels, twisted to reach sealed niches, balanced on unstable rubble, while using these tools added another layer of punishment. Backs gave out, knees failed, shoulders dislocated, and there were no physicians for tomb robbers. You suffered in silence, treating your injuries with the same folk remedies available for legitimate work accidents, never able to explain how you really got hurt. The dust was perhaps your most constant enemy. Every chisel strike, every footstep on ancient floors, every moved object released clouds of fine particles that had settled undisturbed for decades or centuries. This wasn't ordinary dust. It was a toxic blend of limestone powder, natron, the salt used in mummification, deteriorated organic material, and ancient microbes. It coated your skin, filled your lungs, and irritated your eyes until they streamed with tears. Breathing in a tomb meant inhaling this toxic cocktail with every breath. Many robbers developed chronic coughs that lasted the rest of their shortened lives. Some experienced mysterious fevers or wasting illnesses weeks after an expedition. Whether this was from the dust, from fungi and bacteria that had grown in sealed environments, or from the curse, was impossible to determine with ancient medical knowledge. They only knew that tombs made them sick. To combat dust, the more prepared robbers wrapped strips of linen around their faces, an early ancestor to the modern dust mask, though far less effective. Others coated the inside of their nostrils with oil, a technique borrowed from embalmers and perfume makers who worked with pungent materials. Neither method worked particularly well. By the end of a tomb expedition, you'd be coughing up black phlegm and struggling to speak above a raspy whisper. Water was a critical tool often overlooked in romantic notions of tomb robbing. You needed it to drink, to clear dust from your eyes, to dampen a cloth for breathing in the worst conditions. and sometimes to mix with debris to create a paste that could disguise signs of your entry. But water was heavy, containers were breakable or leaked, and carrying too much looked suspicious. Many robbers went thirsty rather than risk detection with large water skins. The greatest tool, perhaps the only truly effective one, was your own body. Your eyes adjusted to work with minimal light. Your fingers developed sensitivity to identify metals by touch when you couldn't see them. Your sense of direction sharpened through repeated nighttime journeys through the necropolis. Your lungs built up a tolerance, though never immunity, to the toxic dust. Your muscles adapted to the specific movements required to break through barriers efficiently. This physical adaptation came at a terrible cost. Few career tomb robbers lived past 30. Their bodies simply broke down from the cumulative damage, lungs scarred by dust, joints destroyed by repetitive impacts, muscles torn from working in unnatural positions, spines damaged from carrying heavy objects through narrow spaces. The tools destroyed their users as surely as they destroyed tomb seals. If a tomb robber managed to acquire better tools, an imported bronze chisel instead of copper, a properly balanced stone hammer, a reinforced lamp that cast more light, they guarded these treasures more carefully than the grave goods they stole. Such implements weren't just useful, they were survival gear that could mean the difference between success and disaster. The cruel irony was that after risking their lives with these inadequate tools, most robbers couldn't keep the majority of what they stole. That golden necklace extracted with bleeding fingers and aching joints would be sold for a fraction of its value to a middleman. The intricate beadwork separated piece by piece in darkness would be disassembled further, the individual components sold separately to avoid identification. Every tomb robber dreamed of finding the perfect tool cache, perhaps abandoned by a previous thief or assembled secretly over years. Few achieved this. Instead, they made do with what they had, innovated when possible, and accepted that their trade was defined by inadequacy. Not just moral or spiritual inadequacy, but the physical inadequacy of trying to break into history's most elaborate security systems with what amounted to sticks and stones. So the next time you see an elaborate tomb raiding scene in a movie, with torches that never go out and tools that never break, remember the reality. Desperate people with failing implements, working by lights so dim they could barely see, breathing air so toxic it shortened their lives with every inhalation, all for a handful of treasures they couldn't even keep. If you thought your inadequate tools were your biggest problem, you were adorably mistaken. The ancient Egyptians weren't exactly naive about the temptation their tomb treasures presented. They knew someone would eventually try to break in, and they planned accordingly with engineering ingenuity that would make modern security experts slow clap in appreciation. While Hollywood has exaggerated some aspects of tomb protection, no giant rolling boulders, the reality was often more subtle and far deadlier. The first and most obvious protective measure was simply making tombs hard to find. Early mastaba tombs were fairly visible, but as tomb robbery became more common, burial practices evolved. Royal tombs were carved deep into cliff faces, hidden in remote valleys, or built with entrances that were completely filled in and disguised after the burial. The location would be kept secret, known only to a few high priests and officials who would maintain the cult of the deceased. Many tombs were built with false entrances, elaborate doorways, and passages leading absolutely nowhere, while the real entrance was a simple, unmarked shaft in a different location. Imagine spending days chiseling through a decorated entrance, only to find a solid rock wall at the end, while the actual treasure chamber was beneath an unremarkable stone you walked across daily. The physical layout of tombs was designed to confuse. Corridors would branch, turn at random angles, split into multiple identical-looking passages, or spiral back on themselves. Without a map, which didn't exist, or intimate knowledge of the design, which was closely guarded, navigating was a nightmare. Some tombs included dead-end chambers specifically designed to trap robbers in an eternal maze. Wrong turn. Enjoy your new forever home, now with 100% more suffocation. Even if you found the right path, the Egyptians had more tricks waiting. Burial chambers were often built on different levels, connected by vertical shafts that could be 30 or 40 feet deep. These shafts served religious purposes, representing the deceased's journey to the underworld, but they also served the practical purpose of breaking the necks of unwary intruders who didn't realize the floor suddenly disappeared in the darkness. Some tombs included narrow passages that suddenly opened into large chambers with dangerously high ceilings. In the dim light of an oil lamp, you wouldn't see the ceiling or the heavy stones deliberately balanced to fall when disturbed by vibration or direct contact. The first warning would be a subtle shift of air pressure, then darkness as your lamp was extinguished by the rush of displaced air, followed by several 100 pounds of limestone introducing itself to your skull. False floors were another favorite. Thin stone slabs or wooden planks covered pits filled with rubble or, in some cases, sharpened stakes. These would hold the weight of the funeral procession, making one careful ceremonial crossing, but would collapse under a robber moving quickly or carrying heavy loot. The more elaborate royal tombs sometimes included trigger stones, pressure plates that, when stepped on, would release counterweights and collapse entire sections of ceiling or wall. Then there were the sealed doors. Not just any sealed doors, complex, multi-ton stone plug blocks fitted so precisely into corridors that even air could barely pass through the seams. These weren't designed to be opened again, ever. They were installed using massive labor forces and sliding ramps that were dismantled after use. Your copper chisel against granite blocks weighing several tons. Good luck with that. Many robbers died of exhaustion trying to create even small openings through such barriers. Some tombs employed water as protection. Passages would be designed to flood seasonally with the Nile's inundation, filling chambers with water for months at a time. Others were built with sections that could be intentionally flooded by priests as a security measure after burial. The water would eventually recede or evaporate, but it left behind damage to any organic materials, including wooden support beams and dangerous structural weaknesses that could collapse under a robber's weight. Even the treasure itself could be booby-trapped. Small holes drilled into hollow statues or boxes allowed priests to insert poisonous substances, powdered toxic minerals, venomous insect parts, or caustic chemicals used in mummification. The first robber to break open such an object would receive a face full of ancient chemical warfare. Analysis of some mummies has revealed arsenic, mercury compounds, and other toxic substances that could cause everything from skin burns to rapid death if handled improperly. But perhaps the most effective trap wasn't physical at all. It was psychological. Tomb builders created spaces designed to disorient, terrify, and confuse. Passages that amplified the slightest sound into bone-chilling echoes. Chambers painted with images of demons who punished tomb violators. Architectural features that created strange drafts, making flames flicker or creating whisper-like sounds. All designed to trigger primal fear in already nervous intruders. Some royal tombs included specific curse chambers where priests would perform rituals to activate spiritual protections. These rooms often contained threatening inscriptions in large hieroglyphs, positioned where they'd be illuminated by any light brought into the chamber. Imagine breaking into a sealed room and having your lamp reveal, directly in front of your face, detailed descriptions of how demons would devour your soul for your transgression. Even the most hardened thief might reconsider their career choice at that moment. The Egyptians understood that most robbers would be at least somewhat superstitious, having been raised in the same culture that built the tombs. They weaponized this by including features like small air shafts that would create moaning sounds when wind passed through them, or chambers designed to produce sudden temperature drops that would feel like a supernatural presence had entered the space. For those who remained undeterred by architectural tricks, psychological warfare, or religious fear, some tombs contained more practical deterrents, guardian statues that concealed living guards. In the early days after a high-status burial, priests would sometimes arrange for guards to be sealed inside hidden chambers with enough supplies to last weeks or months. These guards would emerge through secret passages if they heard intruders, creating the terrifying impression that the statues themselves had come to life to protect the dead. But the most dangerous trap of all was simply poor construction. Not all tombs were built to royal standards with precise engineering. Many were rushed jobs, especially in later periods when resources were scarcer. Unstable ceilings, inadequately supported passages, and improperly cured limestone created death traps that killed indiscriminately. At least an intentional trap was designed to work in a specific way. Random structural failures could strike anyone, anywhere, at any time. The tragic irony, all these elaborate measures ultimately failed. Given enough time, determination, and desperation, human ingenuity found ways around nearly every protection. Robbers developed counter techniques for each defensive measure. They learned to tap walls to locate hollow spaces behind false ones. They tested floors with poles before trusting their weight to them. They brought birds in cages to detect poisonous gases. If the bird died, the humans retreated. They created detailed mental maps of necropolis areas and shared this information within their criminal networks. For every blocked main entrance, robbers found maintenance tunnels used by the original builders. For every flooded passage, they discovered drainage systems or simply waited for dry seasons. For every curse inscription, they developed counter-rituals or protective amulets that they believed would shield them from supernatural consequences. Some of the most successful tomb robberies bypassed the intended entrance entirely. Robbers would identify the approximate location of the burial chamber, then dig their own tunnel from an unprotected direction. Why navigate a maze of trapped corridors when you could create your own direct route? These robbery tunnels have been discovered in many tombs, often crudely carved and dangerously unstable, but effectively circumventing elaborate defensive systems. The battle between tomb builders and tomb robbers escalated over centuries, with each side developing more sophisticated techniques to outwit the other. Tomb architecture became increasingly complex, with false burial chambers, dummy sarcophagi, and treasures hidden in seemingly solid walls. Robbers became more patient, more observant, and more willing to spend months planning a single heist. Perhaps the most telling evidence of this ongoing war comes from tombs that were actually designed with robbery in mind. Some later tombs included easily accessible decoy treasure chambers filled with lower value items, hoping robbers would be satisfied and leave without discovering the main burial deeper inside. Others distributed valuables throughout many small hidden caches, rather than concentrating them in one vulnerable location. It was ancient security thinking that wouldn't be out of place in today's digital world. Assume breach will occur and design accordingly. The psychological impact on robbers who survived these traps was profound. Many developed specific phobias: fear of enclosed spaces, fear of the dark, fear of certain hieroglyphic symbols they associated with dangerous tombs. Some experienced recurring nightmares of being crushed or trapped. Others became obsessively cautious, developing elaborate personal rituals before entering any tomb to test for traps. The lucky ones just had stories of near misses. The unlucky ones were never heard from again, their bodies becoming unintended additions to the tombs they tried to violate. For every magnificent tomb artifact that sits in a museum today, remember this: it likely passed through the hands of someone who navigated a deadly obstacle course of physical traps, architectural deceptions, and psychological warfare to retrieve it. And for every successful heist, countless failed attempts ended with robbers entombed alongside the very people they came to rob, accidental sacrifices to the Egyptian obsession with protecting their journey to the afterlife. If surviving the physical dangers of tomb robbing wasn't challenging enough, the mental torment might finish what the collapsing ceilings and poison traps started. Let's talk about the psychological nightmare that accompanied every step into those forbidden chambers. A horror so profound it haunted robbers long after they escaped back into the sunlight. First, understand that you weren't just breaking into a building. You were violating the boundary between life and death itself. Ancient Egyptians didn't see tombs as mere storage spaces for corpses and treasure. They were fully functioning homes for the deceased's spirit, dimensional gateways where the worlds of the living and dead overlapped. Entering uninvited wasn't just trespassing, it was cosmic breaking and entering. The darkness inside a tomb wasn't just the absence of light. It was primordial, absolute, almost sentient in its oppressiveness. Modern humans rarely experience true darkness. Even at night, we have stars, moon, distant city glow. But deep inside a rock-cut tomb, the darkness had weight and presence. It pressed against your eyeballs, filled your lungs, and whispered to the primal parts of your brain that humans were never meant to go this far from the sun. Your feeble oil lamp created a tiny bubble of dim light that somehow made things worse. The small, illuminated circle around you only emphasized the crushing blackness beyond, and the flickering flame created moving shadows that transformed harmless objects into lurching figures at the edge of your vision. Was that shadow moving on its own, or was it the natural play of your lamp's flame? Your mind constantly suggested the former, even when you knew it was the latter. Then there were the sounds. Tombs were never truly silent. They spoke in a language of subtle acoustic terror. Your own heartbeat echoed back at you from stone walls, sometimes amplified by cleverly designed chambers. The settling of ancient structures created sudden cracks and groans that sounded disturbingly like footsteps or voices. Air moving through narrow passages whistled or moaned with almost human intonation. Your panicked breathing became a soundtrack to your fear, growing louder in your ears as your anxiety increased. And the smell, gods, the smell. Each tomb had its own distinctive olfactory signature, but none were pleasant. Older tombs carried the dusty, slightly sweet odor of ancient decay, natron chemicals, and resins used in mummification. More recently sealed chambers contained the sharper stench of fresh embalming materials and decomposition not yet fully arrested. Some rooms held burnt offerings that left a lingering scent of charred organic material. All of these combined with the limestone dust your activities stirred up, creating an alien atmosphere that constantly reminded you, humans don't belong here. But the most immediate psychological challenge was working literally surrounded by the dead. Imagine crouching in a burial chamber, your lamp illuminating just enough to see the mummy whose eternal rest you're disturbing. The rapt face with its painted eyes seems to watch your every move. The posed hands appear ready to reach out if you turn your back. Even for people culturally familiar with mummification, being alone with these preserved corpses was deeply unsettling. Many tombs contained multiple burials, not just the primary occupant, but family members, servants, or later intrusions who took advantage of existing structures. In some chambers, you might be surrounded by dozens of mummies in various states of preservation. Some still perfectly wrapped and serene, others partially unwrapped by previous robbers, their desiccated faces exposed in frozen expressions that your mind couldn't help but interpret as accusatory or agonized. This wasn't just garden variety creepiness. This was existential terror, grounded in your deepest religious beliefs. Every Egyptian, from farmer to pharaoh, was raised to respect the sanctity of death. You'd grown up with stories of spirits who could reach across the boundary to punish those who disturbed their rest. The concept of divine retribution wasn't abstract theology, it was a visceral certainty. Your entire culture had spent generations reinforcing the idea that what you were doing would condemn your soul to eternal suffering. Hallucinations were common among tomb robbers, especially during longer expeditions. Sleep deprivation, poor air quality, and extreme stress created perfect conditions for the mind to turn against itself. Robbers reported seeing movement from mummies, hearing whispered voices, or feeling unseen hands touch them in the darkness. Some swore they saw hieroglyphs rearrange themselves on walls or felt sudden drops in temperature as if something cold had passed through them. These weren't always dismissed as imagination. In a culture that accepted the supernatural as fact, such experiences were interpreted as legitimate encounters with the angered dead. Some robbers abandoned lucrative heists mid-operation after such incidents, fleeing back to the surface with nothing but terror to show for their efforts. Others performed impromptu offerings or recited hasty prayers to appease whatever they believed they had disturbed. Panic attacks were an occupational hazard. The combination of confined spaces, limited oxygen, and psychological stress triggered the body's fight or flight response. But in a narrow tomb passage, neither fighting nor fleeing was possible. Robbers described episodes of uncontrollable trembling, difficulty breathing, chest pains, and overwhelming dread. Some passed out from hyperventilation, waking later in the darkness, disoriented and even more terrified. The experience of time became distorted underground. With no sun to mark hours and the constant, unchanging darkness, robbers lost track of how long they'd been inside. What felt like minutes might be hours. What seemed like an entire night might only be a brief time. This temporal disorientation added to the dreamlike, nightmarish quality of the experience. Many described feeling as if they'd been swallowed by the tomb, removed from the normal flow of time, and perhaps never to return to it. The most devastating psychological impact often came not during the robbery, but afterward. The mind's attempt to process the experience created lasting trauma that manifested in various ways. Sleep disturbances were nearly universal. Nightmares of being buried alive, of mummies animating, or of divine punishment plagued robbers for years. Some developed insomnia, afraid to close their eyes and return to the darkness they'd experienced. Many tomb robbers showed symptoms we'd now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Sudden panic at seeing certain hieroglyphic symbols, extreme reactions to confined spaces or darkness. Flashbacks triggered by smells similar to those in the tombs. Some became hypervigilant, constantly watching for signs of supernatural retribution or authorities who might have discovered their crimes. The psychological burden was intensified by the need for secrecy. You couldn't talk about your experiences with anyone outside your criminal circle. You couldn't explain to your spouse why you woke up screaming, why you suddenly couldn't bear to enter storage cellars, or why certain religious ceremonies now filled you with inexplicable dread. The trauma had to be processed in isolation, without the community support that humans typically rely on to recover from frightening experiences. For the deeply religious, and most Egyptians were, the spiritual anxiety was perhaps the most debilitating. You had committed not just a crime, but a sacrilege. Every misfortune that befell you or your family afterward became potential evidence of divine punishment. Child sick? The gods are angry. Crop failed? The curse is working. Cut yourself on a tool? The spirits are taking their blood tribute. This constant spiritual hypervigilance created a background radiation of anxiety that never fully dissipated. Some tomb robbers attempted to create psychological defenses against these terrors. They developed elaborate rituals believed to protect them from supernatural harm. Specific prayers before entering, protective amulets, small offerings left near disturbed burials. Others took a different approach, deliberately desecrating mummies as a way to prove to themselves that no divine retribution would follow. Breaking taboos intentionally was a way to numb themselves to the horror of what they were doing. Alcohol became a common coping mechanism. Some drank heavily before expeditions to dull their fear. Others used it afterward to quiet the memories and help them sleep. This created a dangerous cycle of dependency that further marginalized them from mainstream society and often led to mistakes during future tomb robberies. The most successful career tomb robbers were often those who managed to psychologically compartmentalize their activities. They developed a kind of split consciousness, one part that functioned normally in everyday society, another that activated during robberies and contained all the trauma, fear, and moral compromise that came with the work. This psychological partition wasn't healthy, but it was functional, allowing them to continue operating despite the accumulating mental damage. What's particularly tragic is how this psychological burden affected the very families the robbers were trying to support. The personality changes, nightmares, anxiety, substance abuse, and hypervigilance transformed them. Children noticed their once playful father now jumped at shadows and muttered prayers when no one was looking. Spouses found themselves sleeping next to strangers who wouldn't explain why they sometimes woke up gasping for air, clawing at the bedding as if digging their way out of a collapsed passage. The final psychological twist of the knife. After enduring all this mental torment, Most tomb robbers remained poor. The treasures they stole, carrying such a heavy psychological price, were sold for a fraction of their value to middlemen who faced none of the same dangers or trauma. The brief financial relief rarely justified the permanent mental scars. So while we often focus on the physical dangers tomb robbers faced, perhaps their greatest enemies weren't the traps, guards, or punishments. Their greatest enemies were the darkness, the silence, the faces of the dead, and most of all, their own minds, filled with cultural conditioning that turned every creaking sound into an approaching spirit, and every misfortune into confirmation of a curse that would follow them into their own graves and beyond. The man you trusted most slit your friend's throat for a golden amulet. The blood pooled black in the torchlight as your so-called partner vanished into the darkness with the prize. You weren't even surprised, because in the tomb robbing business, betrayal wasn't the exception. It was the business model. Truth is, you couldn't rob a tomb alone, but every person who knew your secret was another chance to end up impaled in the public square. Welcome to the ultimate trust paradox. You needed partners to survive, therefore you increased your chances of betrayal, but you couldn't work alone, therefore you accepted the risk. Quite the career counseling nightmare, right? Even pyramid scheme salespeople had more job security. Think about it. Tombs were sealed with massive stone blocks. Someone had to help move them. The passages were maze-like and confusing. Someone had to stand watch. The goods were heavy and numerous. Someone had to help carry them. Your accomplices weren't optional, they were essential, but that necessity came with existential danger. Most tomb robbing networks formed through family connections first. Brothers, cousins, uncles, people bound by blood ties that supposedly ran deeper than greed. You started small, with people who had as much to lose as you did. Your brother held the lamp while you chiseled. Your cousin kept watch outside while you both worked inside. The family that grave robs together stays together until they don't. Because family betrayal cut deeper than any blade, like the tomb robber from Thebes who was turned in by his own son seeking clemency for a different crime. My father taught me everything, he testified before the vizier's court. The boy lived, his father didn't. Imagine spending your last moments on the impalement stake knowing your own child put you there. Family dinners in the afterlife would be awkward, to say the least. As operations grew more ambitious, you needed specialists. Someone who knew the layout of particular tombs. Someone with access to tools. Someone who could sell the goods without attracting attention. Your small family operation expanded into a criminal network built on nothing sturdier than mutual desperation and temporary alignment of interests. It was like playing musical chairs with executioners. Trust wasn't given, it was tested. New recruits started as lookouts, positioned far enough away that they couldn't see the actual tomb entrance. If guards appeared, they'd sound a warning, but couldn't betray the exact location. Promotion within the ranks came only after multiple successful jobs. Information was compartmentalized. The less each person knew about the overall operation, the less they could reveal under torture. Because nobody planned to talk, but everyone broke eventually. The torture methods of ancient Egypt would make modern intelligence agencies both horrified and slightly impressed. Beatings were just the appetizer. Suspects were burned with hot metal. Joints were dislocated one by one. Noses, ears, and other appendages were sliced off in stages. The phrase, "death by 1,000 cuts," wasn't just a metaphor, it was standard operating procedure. Under such persuasion, loyalty had a remarkably short shelf life. Sometimes betrayal wasn't even intentional, like the drunk tomb robber who boasted in a tavern about his sudden wealth. By morning, he was in chains. Or the thief who gave his wife a stolen necklace, not realizing she'd wear it to market, where a temple guard recognized it from a funerary description. Simple carelessness killed as surely as deliberate betrayal. The truly insidious part. Authorities actively encouraged betrayal through a crude early version of the prisoner's dilemma. The first to confess and implicate others often received reduced punishment, maybe just a severe beating and mutilation instead of impalement. Such generosity. It's like being offered a punch in the face instead of a gunshot. Technically better, but still not making your day. Every successful job increased both your wealth and your vulnerability. More valuable items meant more temptation for partners to eliminate competition. More operations meant more people who knew your secrets. More wealth meant more visible signs of your crimes. Success and disaster held hands like lovers. The artifacts themselves seem to encourage betrayal. Gold has a way of whispering to the human heart, promising escape from poverty if only that pesky partner would disappear. Many tomb robbers met their end, not at the hands of authorities, but at the hands of their own crew, somewhere in the darkness between the tomb and the surface. At least the mummies got company. Then there were the professional betrayers, people who specialized in infiltrating tomb-robbing rings, only to turn them in for reward. These weren't official agents, but opportunists playing both sides. They'd join operations, learn names and methods, then sell the information to temple authorities or the vizier's police. Some made careers of it, moving from region to region so their reputations wouldn't precede them. Think of them as ancient undercover cops, except with absolutely no oversight, accountability, or moral compass. Even successful tomb robbers couldn't enjoy their wealth openly. Sudden prosperity raised questions. That new house? Inherited from a distant relative? Those gold earrings your wife wore? Family heirlooms? That improved diet that added some meat to your children's bones? Just good farming this season. Every lie had to be maintained, every story kept straight. You lived in fear that neighbors, seeing your improved circumstances, would put the pieces together and report you. The most successful tomb robbing operations typically included at least one person of higher social status, a temple scribe, a minor official, or a craftsman who worked on royal projects. These insiders provided crucial information about tomb locations, security measures, and the timing of religious observances when tombs would be unguarded. But they also demanded larger shares while taking fewer risks, and their connections meant they could easily sacrifice the rest of the crew if things went south. Social inequality followed you even into your criminal career. Some things never change. Consider the famous tomb robbery trials of the 20th dynasty, documented in papyri that have miraculously survived. A widespread network of tomb robbers had systematically looted royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. When authorities finally caught on, the betrayals cascaded like dominoes. The court records read like a soap opera of accusation and counter-accusation. It was his idea. He took the largest share. I was forced to participate. By the end, over 40 people had implicated each other, from common laborers to priests. The executions that followed were public, prolonged, and designed to discourage future tomb robbers. It didn't work. What's particularly fascinating is how tomb robbers tried to create codes of conduct to minimize betrayal risk. Never rob tombs near your home village. Never sell items to unknown buyers. Never display unusual wealth. Break up larger items and sell the pieces separately. These weren't written down because writing incriminating guidelines would be impressively stupid, but passed along through whispered advice from veteran thieves. Some partnerships did manage to last. Bonds forged in the extreme stress and danger of tomb robbing could create loyalty that transcended ordinary relationships. Men who had pulled each other from tomb collapses, who had hidden each other during guard patrols, who had sweated and bled together in the suffocating darkness, these partnerships sometimes endured. They became a strange kind of family, bound by shared crimes and secrets. When these relationships worked, they were based on something stronger than fear, mutual survival. But most didn't last. The pressure was too great, the temptations too strong, the risks too high. For every story of loyal partners, there were dozens of betrayals. It was simple mathematics of human weakness. The odds were never in your favor. The worst betrayals came from the black market dealers who bought your stolen goods. These middlemen, often foreigners from Phoenicia, Libya, or elsewhere, would build relationships with tomb-robbing crews, offering fair prices and seeming reliability. Then, once they knew your patterns, they might simply ambush you during a transaction, taking both the goods and your life. Or they'd report you after several successful deals, having already moved the valuable items out of the region. You were disposable. The gold was not. For women involved in tomb robbing, usually as receivers of stolen goods or as strategists rather than physical diggers, the dangers of betrayal carried additional dimensions. Their testimony was valued less in court, but their punishments were just as severe, and they faced specific vulnerabilities. The wife of a tomb robber from Memphis was offered a terrible choice: sexual submission to a corrupt official or the exposure of her husband's crimes. She chose a third option: poison. It didn't end well for anyone involved. What does all this tell us? That crime built on violating sacred spaces could never create honor among thieves. That desperation and opportunity make for unstable partnerships. That systems of extreme inequality create not just the conditions for crime, but the conditions for betrayal. In the end, many tomb robbers died alone, betrayed by the very people they had trusted with their lives. And as you stand in museums today, looking at sarcophagi and funeral goods that somehow made their way from sealed tombs to glass cases thousands of miles away, remember this: behind every artifact is a story not just of the noble Egyptian who commissioned it, but of the desperate thief who stole it, and quite possibly the partner who betrayed them for it. Trust no one, especially when you're surrounded by cursed gold and the angry dead. Your hands trembled as you unwrapped the first layer of linen from the mummy's face. Not from fear of guards or collapse, but from something deeper, a primal dread as ancient as the Nile itself. The curse inscriptions you'd just passed promised your organs would be devoured by demons. Your children would die screaming. Your name would vanish from history. But hunger drives even the superstitious to blasphemy. Therefore you kept unwrapping, but your dreams would never be the same again. Curses weren't Hollywood inventions. They were psychological warfare, etched in stone and papyrus throughout Egyptian tombs. These weren't gentle suggestions or vague warnings. They were specific, graphic promises of supernatural retribution. As for anyone who enters this tomb impurely, I shall seize him by his neck like a bird. I shall cast the fear of myself into him. That's an actual inscription, and it gets worse from there. The Egyptians weren't playing around with their afterlife security system. Most tomb robbers could recite common curse formulations by heart, but that didn't make them any less terrifying in the moment. There's something uniquely disturbing about reading a personalized death threat while standing in absolute darkness, surrounded by the bodies of the people who wrote it. It's like getting a text message from a ghost, except the ghost owns all the real estate around you and specifically prepared for your arrival centuries ago. Talk about planning ahead for unwanted visitors. Makes those no soliciting signs on modern doors seem rather quaint. The curses followed consistent patterns. First, they identified potential violators. As for any man who enters this tomb, then they detailed the supernatural punishment. His soul shall belong to the fire, his corpse shall not receive water. Finally, they often involved the gods directly. Anubis the powerful one shall be after him, and I will wring his neck like a bird's. Reading these by flickering lamplight, even the most hardened thief felt a chill that had nothing to do with the tomb's temperature. But did the curses work? The answer is both yes and no, in ways more fascinating than any mummy movie. Let's start with the psychological impact. Imagine you've just violated the most sacred taboo in your culture. You're crouched in a sealed chamber that was never meant to see light again, surrounded by religious texts promising your eternal damnation. Your breath echoes in the silence. Dust from disturbed remains fills your lungs. The weight of religious conditioning, years of priests warning about afterlife judgment, presses down on you heavier than the pyramid stones above. Under these conditions, the mind creates its own curses. Tomb robbers reported seeing glowing apparitions, hearing whispers, feeling invisible hands clutching at their clothes. Modern psychology would call this the power of suggestion combined with extreme stress, sensory deprivation, and oxygen deprivation in poorly ventilated tombs. Ancient Egyptians called it the wrath of the gods. Either way, the effects were very real. Many tomb robbers developed what we'd now recognize as symptoms of PTSD after their expeditions. Nightmares, paranoia, unexplained illnesses. When something bad happened in their lives, a child's fever, a failed crop, a sudden accident, they attributed it to the curse they'd triggered. The psychological burden became a curse of its own, sometimes driving thieves to confession, madness, or suicide. The mind, it turns out, doesn't need actual magic to destroy itself. But here's where it gets interesting. Some of the supernatural effects of tomb curses had very natural explanations. Remember that Egyptian embalmers were master chemists who understood how to preserve bodies for eternity. They worked with toxic substances like natron, formaldehyde-like compounds, mercury, arsenic, and various fungi and bacteria. These substances remained potent in sealed tombs for centuries. When tomb robbers disturbed these chemical preservatives, they often experienced very real poisoning. Rashes appeared on skin that brushed against treated surfaces. Eyes burned from ancient spore dust. Lungs filled with toxic particles. In confined spaces with poor air circulation, these exposures could cause hallucinations, illness, and even death. To the thieves, it seemed the mummy itself was fighting back. In reality, it was ancient Egyptian chemistry still at work thousands of years later. The pharaoh's revenge came not from the afterlife, but from his embalmer's toolkit. There were biological hazards too. Sealed tombs might preserve harmful bacteria and molds that, when disturbed, caused infections and respiratory diseases. Some researchers suggest that certain tombs contained pathogenic fungi like Aspergillus niger, which can cause fatal pneumonia when inhaled in large quantities. When tomb robbers developed mysterious illnesses days after their heists, they weren't experiencing supernatural punishment, just good old-fashioned infectious disease without the benefit of antibiotics. Not that the distinction mattered much when you were coughing up blood. The stories spread through whispers. A thief who stole a golden scarab beetle found his body covered in sores, shaped like beetles, before he died. Another who defaced a mummy became paralyzed, his body stiff as the corpse he'd violated. A man who melted down a funeral mask watched his own face melt from a mysterious fever. These tales grew with each retelling, enhanced by superstition and the human love of pattern matching. But they served a purpose. They kept many potential thieves away from the tombs. Of course, not all tomb robbers believed in curses. Some, particularly those from outside Egypt, or those who'd abandoned traditional religion, dismissed the warnings as empty threats meant to scare the superstitious. These skeptics often took special pleasure in defacing curse inscriptions as they worked, as if to prove their immunity to divine wrath. Historical records suggest these bold individuals didn't fare any better or worse than their superstitious colleagues. The gods, it seems, didn't particularly care about the personal beliefs of those they punished. There were ways to counter curses, or so tomb robbers believed. Protective amulets, specific prayers to apologize to the dead or appease the gods, rituals performed before and after the robbery. Some thieves would leave small offerings in place of what they took, a spiritual exchange that they hoped would neutralize the curse. Others would never take certain objects considered especially powerful, funerary texts, heart scarabs, or items with the deceased's name inscribed, like leaving the gun but taking the cannoli, except with sacred artifacts and eternal damnation. The most common countermeasure was simple: destroy the name of the deceased, wherever you found it. Ancient Egyptians believed that a person's name was essential to their afterlife existence. If the name was erased, the dead could not identify you as their violator. This is why many recovered artifacts show deliberate damage to cartouches and name inscriptions. It wasn't random vandalism, it was spiritual self-defense. In a belief system where words held power, erasing the right words seemed like reasonable insurance. Some tomb robbers went further, bringing their own religious specialists on expeditions. These weren't priests from official temples, who would never participate in such sacrilege. but practitioners of folk magic who operated in the shadows of Egyptian society. They would perform counter-rituals, recite protective spells, or even conduct impromptu exorcisms if something felt wrong during the robbery. Think of them as supernatural security consultants, charging premium rates for spiritual protection of dubious efficacy. The most famous cursed tomb in history, Tutankhamun's, wasn't discovered until 1922, but it perfectly illustrates how curse beliefs persist. When several people connected to the excavation died in the years following, newspapers worldwide proclaimed, "The mummy's curse strikes again." The reality? Most lived long lives, and those who died succumbed to common illnesses or accidents statistically normal for the time. Lord Carnarvon, whose death sparked the legend, actually died from an infected mosquito bite. Not exactly the spectacular divine retribution promised in curse texts. But the myth persists because it satisfies something in human psychology. We want to believe that violating sacred spaces has consequences, that the universe has some inherent justice system, that the dead can defend themselves against the living who would disturb their rest. It's almost comforting in a strange way. For ancient tomb robbers, curses created a terrible psychological paradox. The more they believed, the more they suffered from guilt, fear, and stress-induced symptoms. The less they believed, the more reckless they became, taking greater risks and often facing very real physical dangers as a result. There was no winning this game, only varying degrees of losing. Many career tomb robbers developed a complicated relationship with curses. They acknowledged their power while creating elaborate justifications for why they personally might be exempt. "I only steal from the wealthy dead who can spare it. I leave the body undisturbed, taking only objects. I am driven by necessity, not greed." These mental gymnastics rarely provided true peace, but they allowed the thief to function in the moment. The saddest cases were those who, years after their tomb robbing days, became consumed by curse anxiety in their old age. As natural illnesses and misfortunes accumulated, as they do for everyone, these aging thieves interpreted each pain, each loss, each nightmare as delayed payment for their youthful sacrilege. Some spent their final years in religious obsession, seeking forgiveness through donations to temples or extreme piety. Others simply drank themselves into oblivion, trying to forget what couldn't be unforgotten. So were the curses real? It depends entirely on what you mean by real. They weren't magical spells that reached out across the veil of death, but they were psychological weapons that caused genuine suffering. They were warnings about very real chemical and biological hazards. And for those who believed in them, they were as real as anything in the ancient world. Next time you walk through a museum's Egyptian collection, look closely at the funerary objects. Many still bear their original curse inscriptions, promising torment to those who disturb them. Yet here they sit, thousands of miles from their intended resting places. The question isn't whether the curses failed, it's what price was paid by those who triggered them. Not all scars are visible, and not all punishments come from the gods. You've survived the traps, dodged the guards, evaded betrayal, even convinced yourself the curses won't follow you home. Now comes the truly dangerous part, selling what you've stolen. Because a golden Ushabti figurine isn't worth dying for if you can't convert it to food. But try walking into the village market with a 3,000-year-old royal artifact and see how long you last before the vizier's men arrive. Welcome to the tomb robber's final challenge, turning sacrilege into survival without getting caught. The first rule of the ancient Egyptian black market: never, ever sell locally. The golden collar that once adorned a pharaoh's neck was instantly recognizable to any priest or official in the region where it was buried. Therefore, you needed to move your goods far from their source, but transportation itself exposed you to checkpoints and suspicious guards. Moving stolen goods required complex logistics worthy of a military campaign, except your army consisted of sweaty, paranoid criminals instead of trained soldiers. The comparison doesn't flatter either group. Most successful tomb robbers didn't sell directly to end buyers. The risks were too great, the knowledge too specialized. Instead, they worked through middlemen, the ancient world's version of pawnbrokers. Only with a side business, in blasphemy and capital crimes. These intermediaries operated in the shadows between legitimate trade and criminal enterprise, often maintaining respectable public businesses as cover. The pottery merchant who asked no questions about the gold you brought him, the incense trader who had mysterious connections in distant cities, the foreign merchant who could make valuable items disappear across borders. These middlemen were both essential and dangerous. They knew your secrets, they knew the real value of your goods, and they paid you a pittance compared to what they'd eventually receive. A golden pectoral worth a small fortune might earn you enough to feed your family for a few months. The middleman would sell it for 10 times that amount to a wealthy collector or melt it down for its raw material value. But you couldn't complain about the markup. What were you going to do? Report him to the Better Business Bureau of Thebes for unfair pricing on your grave robbery proceeds. The pricing structure was brutal but predictable. Common items like small amulets or basic jewelry might fetch 10 to 20% of their actual value. Rarer items with distinctive designs earned even less, perhaps 5 to 10%, because they were harder to resell without raising suspicion. Only raw materials approached fair value. Gold could be melted down, gems could be reset, and these brought higher percentages since they could enter the legitimate market undetected. This economic reality led to the heartbreaking destruction of priceless artifacts. Intricate golden masks hammered flat and melted into ingots. Jeweled collars broken apart for individual stones. Historical and artistic value meant nothing when discovery meant death. Foreign buyers played a crucial role in this underground economy. Phoenician traders, Hittite merchants, Nubian travelers, anyone outside the Egyptian religious and legal system made ideal customers. They didn't share Egyptian reverence for these objects. To them, a mummified cat wasn't a sacred vessel for a soul's journey to the afterlife. It was an exotic curiosity to display in their home. These foreign buyers created distance between the theft and final sale, reducing risk for everyone in the chain except you, the original thief. The black market had seasonal rhythms, just like legitimate commerce. During major religious festivals when pilgrims flooded temple cities, dealers could move merchandise more easily amidst the crowds and confusion. Wartime created opportunities as well. Egyptian artifacts became popular souvenirs for foreign mercenaries and soldiers. But the trade never stopped entirely. As long as Egyptian tombs contained valuables and people elsewhere coveted them, the invisible pipeline connecting sacred burial grounds to distant markets remained active. Some items were considered too dangerous to sell at any price. Objects inscribed with the deceased's name, ritual items with powerful religious significance, things marked with royal seals or divine symbols. These carried the highest risk of recognition and the strongest curses. Experienced thieves left these behind, or, if accidentally taken, destroyed them quickly. It was bad business to die screaming from a mysterious wasting disease traced back to the amulet you just sold. Bad for repeat customers. The cleverest tomb robbers developed techniques to make stolen goods less recognizable. Gold items would be slightly damaged, then repaired with different techniques to disguise their origin. Distinctive gems would be recut into smaller stones. Inscriptions would be carefully filed away. These modified items could then be sold at higher prices since they carried less risk. It was ancient artifact laundering, destroying historical context one file mark at a time. Sometimes the middlemen themselves became targets. A particularly successful dealer might accumulate significant wealth and inventory, making them tempting marks for their own suppliers. Imagine stealing from your fence, who can't exactly report the theft of already stolen goods. These second-order robberies created a strange karmic cycle in the criminal underworld, with property circling through multiple hands, each thief convinced they were cleverer than the last. Honor among thieves remained as mythical as the curses they all secretly feared. For tomb robbers working near major trading centers like Memphis or port cities along the Mediterranean, international export provided the safest option. Artifacts loaded onto ships bound for distant ports couldn't be easily traced. Within days, a statuette that had rested in darkness for centuries could be sailing to Byblos, Crete, or beyond. Archaeological discoveries throughout the Mediterranean basin confirm this ancient international trade in looted Egyptian antiquities. Your ill-gotten contraband might end up adorning the home of a wealthy merchant in Athens or a temple in Tyre, appreciated for its exotic craftsmanship, but disconnected from its sacred purpose. The riskiest moment in any tomb robber's career wasn't inside the tomb. It was the transaction. Each sale created witnesses. Each exchange left traces. A sudden influx of wealth raised questions. Neighbors noticed new clothes, better food, home improvements. Therefore, successful thieves developed elaborate cover stories to explain their improved circumstances. Inheritance from a distant relative, a lucky trade deal, a secondary craft practiced in spare hours. These lies required constant maintenance, creating a secondary burden beyond the physical and spiritual risks of the original crime. The more successful you became, the more dangerous your position. Small-time thieves who stole occasionally to survive often escaped notice. Career tomb robbers who moved significant quantities of valuable goods eventually attracted attention. The authorities weren't fools. They noticed patterns. They cultivated informants. They compared reports of tomb violations with rumors of newfound wealth. The mathematics of risk worked against you. Each transaction multiplied your exposure until discovery became almost inevitable. Some tomb robbers tried to reduce risk by working with corrupt officials. A guard captain who would look the other way, a temple scribe who could alter inventory records, a port inspector who wouldn't search certain crates. These arrangements required significant bribes, often 50% or more of proceeds, and still provided no guarantees. Your corrupt partner might simply wait until you'd accumulated enough valuable goods, then arrest you and claim all the merchandise as recovered stolen property. Officially recovered artifacts often mysteriously diminished in quantity between discovery and official recording. The black market for tomb goods created its own peculiar economy alongside Egypt's legitimate trade networks. Professional appraisers specialized in quickly valuing stolen artifacts without documentation. Secret workshops existed solely to modify recognizable pieces into anonymous valuables. Dedicated storage facilities housed goods until heat from a particular theft died down. Messages passed through coded language. "My cousin from the West has brought unusual shells," might signal the arrival of items from a recently breached tomb in the Valley of the Kings. What happened to tomb robbers who successfully navigated this treacherous marketplace? Most remained poor despite their dangerous work. The economic structure of the trade ensured that real profits flowed upward to middlemen and corrupt officials. A lifetime of risk might leave you slightly better off than your legitimate neighbors, but rarely led to significant wealth. The few who did accumulate substantial riches typically combined tomb robbing with other criminal enterprises, or managed to establish themselves as middlemen rather than frontline thieves. The most successful thieves eventually retired from active robbery to focus on the safer, more profitable business of moving goods for others. They became the next generation of middlemen, using their experience and connections to build more sustainable criminal careers. Some even achieved a strange form of respectability in their later years, their origins forgotten as they aged into apparently legitimate merchants whose wealth no one questioned too closely. Time launders reputation almost as effectively as it buries history. For modern archaeologists and historians, this ancient black market created a double tragedy. First, countless priceless artifacts were destroyed to hide their origins, melted, broken, defaced, until their historical context vanished. Second, the artifacts that survived intact were scattered across the ancient world without documentation, leaving enormous gaps in our understanding of Egyptian civilization. That beautiful funerary statue in a modern museum might have been looted just decades after its creation, meaning its true provenance has been lost for thousands of years. This ancient trade never really ended. It evolved. When European collectors developed taste for Egyptian antiquities in the 18th and 19th centuries, They simply plugged into networks that had existed since pharaonic times. The scale expanded, the prices increased, but the basic structure remained remarkably similar. Modern smugglers of Egyptian artifacts are the direct professional descendants of those first desperate thieves who dared to breach sacred tombs for profit. What connects the ancient tomb robber to today's black market antiquities dealer isn't just the commodities they trade, it's the fundamental economic reality that drives both. As long as people desire rare, forbidden things, someone will risk everything to provide them. The tomb robber's final transaction, converting stolen history into survival, completes a cycle that began with the first royal burial and continues to this day in shadow markets around the world. Next time you see an Egyptian artifact in a museum with vague provenance described as private collection or acquired in the 19th century, remember this: you're probably looking at the end point of a chain that began with a desperate thief who risked everything, got almost nothing, and disappeared from history, while the treasure they discovered endures, silent about the hands that carried it from darkness into light. History remembers the pharaohs who built the tombs, but rarely the desperate souls who emptied them. Yet tomb robbers shaped Egyptian history as surely as any king. Their shadowy work created a bizarre archaeological record where almost every royal tomb was found violated, despite elaborate protections. Let's pull back the veil on some of history's most audacious grave robberies. Operations so significant, they forced changes in royal burial practices and occasionally brought dynasties to their knees. The most thoroughly documented tomb robberies in ancient history come from a remarkable source: the Egyptians themselves. The tomb robbery papyri contain actual transcripts of criminal trials from the late 20th dynasty, around 1100 BCE. These aren't Hollywood scripts or legends. They're court records with testimony, confessions, and sentencing details. Reading them feels like eavesdropping on ancient true crime, complete with corrupt officials, professional thieves, and interrogation techniques that would make modern police departments nervously clear their throats. The Abbott Papyrus details an official investigation into the widespread looting of royal tombs in the Theban necropolis. What began as routine inspection became something far more dramatic when investigators discovered that almost every royal tomb they checked had been breached. Only Amenhotep I's burial appeared untouched. The others, stripped of valuables with mummies damaged or destroyed. The investigation snowballed into what Egyptologists now call the Great Tomb Robbery Scandal, perhaps the largest organized crime investigation of the ancient world. What makes these records so extraordinary is their detail. We don't just learn that tombs were robbed, we learn exactly how the robberies happened, directly from the thieves themselves. One confession describes using copper tools to cut through sealed doors. Another details how thieves navigated pitch-black passages by following air currents. A third recounts dividing golden funeral masks into portable pieces for easier transport. It's like reading an ancient Egyptian version of a heist movie, except with more torture and fewer happy endings. Consider the confession of Amenpanufa, a stonemason who admitted to robbing the tomb of King Sobekemsaf II. He described gathering a team of 8 men, breaking through the outer seal, navigating to the burial chamber, and finding the king's mummy adorned with gold. We collected all the gold we found on the noble mummy of this god, together with his amulets and ornaments that were on his neck and the coffins in which he rested, he testified. They then set fire to the coffins and stole everything of value before escaping. A once mighty pharaoh reduced to plunder by working-class thieves with basic tools and remarkable audacity. The most astonishing aspect of these confessions is their matter-of-fact tone. Thieves describe measuring passages, planning entry points, and dividing labor with the methodical precision of professional engineers. One group even brought beer and food for a meal break midway through their sacrilege. It was tomb robbing as organized business, complete with specialized roles, advanced planning, and established protocols for dividing the spoils. Not all famous tomb robberies came to light through trials. Some we know about only through archaeological evidence. the aftermath of ancient crimes preserved for millennia. When Howard Carter discovered Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, he found it mostly intact, but with clear signs of early robbery. The tomb had been entered at least twice in antiquity, with the outer chambers ransacked. Only a hasty reburial and the tomb's accidental concealment beneath debris from a later construction project saved it from complete looting. Without those lucky breaks, we'd never have seen the golden mask that's now among the most famous artifacts in human history. Sometimes archaeological history hangs by the thinnest threads of fortune. Even more dramatic was the discovery of DB 320, a cliff tomb near Deir el-Bahri. When archaeologists entered in 1881, they found an astonishing sight: over 40 royal mummies piled together in a single chamber. Investigation revealed this wasn't a mass royal burial, but an ancient rescue operation. Temple priests of the 21st dynasty, overwhelmed by rampant tomb robbery, had gathered pharaonic mummies from violated tombs and hidden them together in this obscure location. This desperate measure saved the bodies of Egypt's greatest rulers, including Ramesses II and Thutmose III, but without their treasures and original context. It was damage control on a civilization-wide scale. Some tomb robberies were inside jobs that would make modern corruption scandals look amateurish. The workers who built the tombs, skilled craftsmen who knew every passage, trap, and treasure location, were often the first to rob them. Records from the workmen's village of Deir el-Medina reveal that some craftsmen apparently built secret access tunnels during construction. Like installing a back door in computer security, these hidden passages allowed future entry while bypassing official seals and traps. It was the ultimate employment benefit plan: build a tomb by day, plunder it by night. The most successful tomb robbers were never caught, leaving no records of their exploits. But we can trace their handiwork through the desperate countermeasures Egyptian authorities implemented over centuries. Royal burial practices evolved directly in response to tomb robbery. Early pyramids gave way to hidden rock-cut tombs. Single burials became complex multi-chamber labyrinths. Fake burial chambers were constructed to confuse thieves. Treasures were disguised or miniaturized. Each innovation reflected hard-learned lessons from successful robberies. It was an arms race between the living and the dead, with tomb robbers driving the evolution of Egyptian funerary architecture. Not all tomb robberies were clandestine operations. Some occurred during periods of civil unrest, when government authority collapsed. The first intermediate period, around 2050 BCE, saw widespread tomb robbery conducted almost openly as central authority disintegrated. Similar waves of legitimate looting occurred during other transitional periods. When no one enforced the laws, the distinction between theft and salvage blurred. Some officials likely authorized the recycling of older tomb goods during resource shortages, providing a thin veneer of legitimacy to what was essentially state-sponsored grave robbery. Perhaps the most impressive tomb robbery operation targeted Khufu's Great Pyramid at Giza. The massive structure was breached sometime after the Old Kingdom's collapse, with thieves tunneling through solid limestone to reach the burial chamber. The engineering knowledge required was considerable, suggesting this wasn't opportunistic theft, but a planned operation by skilled workers. They left behind a crude tunnel that tourists still use to enter the pyramid today. Think about that. Millions of visitors annually follow a passage originally carved by ancient criminals. Tomb robbers literally shaped how we access Egypt's greatest monument. Some robberies were bizarre in their selectivity. In several royal tombs, thieves took portable valuables, but left larger items that would have been difficult to transport or sell. In others, they specifically targeted certain materials, taking all the gold but leaving silver, or harvesting copper tools while ignoring ritual objects. This pattern suggests professional thieves with specific buyers already arranged. It was targeted shopping, not random looting. Some robbers even left behind valuable items positioned in ways that would make them easier to retrieve on a planned return visit that never happened. These abandoned treasures offer tantalizing glimpses of interrupted criminal enterprises. The economic impact of tomb robbery was staggering. Estimates suggest that during certain periods, more precious metals circulated in Egypt from looted tombs than from active mines. This created a shadow economy where royal treasures, supposedly sealed away forever, actually re-entered circulation, financing everything from palace conspiracies to foreign trade. Gold, recycled from royal burials, might be traded to Nubian merchants, melted into new jewelry, or even used to gild temples dedicated to the very gods whose protection the original owners had sought in death. The cosmic irony would not have been lost on Egyptian theologians. One of the most audacious tomb robberies occurred at the Temple of Hatshepsut, where thieves somehow removed a massive solid gold shrine piece by piece over multiple nights. The logistics required to dismantle, transport, and dispose of such distinctive royal property without detection suggests either incredible luck or high-level protection. Modern Egyptologists suspect the latter, a conspiracy involving temple priests who had access, authority, and motive. Some ancient criminal enterprises operated with impunity that would make modern crime syndicates envious. The aftermath of famous tomb robberies often brought waves of judicial terror. The Great Tomb Robbery trials ended with mass executions designed to deter future thieves. Records indicate that some convicted robbers were impaled on stakes outside the very necropolis they had violated, dying slowly over days as a warning to others. These gruesome public punishments temporarily suppressed tomb robbery, but never eliminated it. Within a generation, new thieves would emerge, convinced they had learned from their predecessors' mistakes. Desperation consistently proved stronger than deterrence. Perhaps the most successful tomb robbers in history remain completely anonymous. When Egyptologists discovered KV5, the massive tomb of Ramesses II's sons, in the Valley of the Kings, they found it had been methodically emptied in antiquity, without a trace of the thieves' identities. No trial records, no confessions, no court accomplices. Just an enormous royal tomb, systematically stripped of valuables by ghosts who slipped back into history, leaving nothing but empty chambers behind. Such perfect crimes likely occurred more often than we realize, with only the failures entering historical record. The great irony is that these ancient criminals unwittingly preserved history even as they plundered it. The Abbot Papyrus, created to document their crimes, provides our most complete list of royal burials from certain dynasties. Priest-led reburial of mummies rescued from robbed tombs preserved royal bodies that would otherwise have disintegrated. Even the robbers' tunnels themselves sometimes reveal construction techniques and hidden chambers that might otherwise remain unknown. Like remoras attached to sharks, tomb robbers inadvertently carried fragments of Egyptian civilization through time. The legacy of these famous tomb robberies extends into modern museums worldwide. That stunning piece of royal jewelry in London likely passed through many hands after its first illegal removal from a tomb. The elaborate stone sarcophagus in Paris, probably emptied of its original occupant by ancient thieves before being rediscovered empty by archaeologists millennia later. Almost every major Egyptian artifact carries the invisible fingerprints of tomb robbers, whose desperate work forms an unacknowledged link in the chain connecting ancient burial to modern display. Tomb robbers weren't just thieves. They were unwilling agents of historical redistribution, ensuring that what was meant to remain sealed in darkness eventually emerged into light. Without their forbidden work, their tunneling, their prying, their irreverent handling of the sacred, much of what we know about ancient Egypt would remain buried forever in uninvestigated tombs. It's an uncomfortable truth that archaeologists rarely acknowledge. Some of history's greatest treasures were first unearthed by its most desperate criminals. You risked execution, divine wrath, and eternal damnation to steal a golden collar that once adorned a pharaoh's neck. The artifacts you pried from cold, dead hands were worth a king's ransom. Therefore, you'd finally escape the grinding poverty that drove you to this desperate trade, right? Wrong. The cruel irony of tomb robbing. Even when you succeeded, you failed. The treasures of the afterlife rarely translated to comfort in this one. Instead, most tomb robbers remained trapped in poverty despite their blasphemous efforts, creating a bitter cycle where each risky heist barely sustained them until the next. The economics of tomb robbery were ruthlessly stacked against the actual thieves. Remember the black market structure we explored earlier? The middlemen, fences, and corrupt officials who formed the distribution chain? Each link extracted its toll. That exquisite golden pectoral worth a fortune might fetch you 10% of its actual value when sold to a fence. The fence would sell it to a merchant for 30%. The merchant would move it to a foreign buyer for 60%. By the time your stolen treasure reached its final destination, everyone but you had profited handsomely. Consider the actual numbers from historical records. A skilled craftsman in ancient Egypt earned about 11 deben, a weight of copper, per month, enough to purchase basic necessities for a small family. A golden funerary mask might contain gold worth hundreds of deben, but after the risks of extraction and the brutal discounts of illegal sales, the thief might receive 20 to 30 deben total. A few months of moderate comfort at most. Not exactly the lavish lifestyle change that would justify risking impalement. The practical limitations of selling stolen artifacts created a cash flow problem no modern financial advisor could solve. You couldn't offload everything at once. That would raise suspicion. Therefore, you sold items incrementally, often at the worst possible moments when desperation forced your hand. Like a lottery winner who squanders their windfall, most tomb robbers burned through their proceeds quickly, finding themselves back at square one with nothing but increased risk exposure to show for their efforts. Imagine stealing a fortune in golden artifacts only to sell them for the equivalent of a used Toyota Corolla, except the Corolla is actually just enough grain to feed your family for a few months. And instead of a simple traffic ticket if you're caught, it's slow death by impalement. The risk-reward calculation seems insane until you remember the alternative, watching your children starve. Poverty creates its own desperate logic, where terrible options become rational choices when they're the only choices available. Some tomb robbers attempted to improve their financial outcomes by learning metalworking skills to process their stolen goods. By melting down distinctive items into anonymous ingots, they could potentially sell gold closer to its actual value. But this approach required equipment, expertise, and time, all in short supply for desperate thieves. Most lacked the resources to become effective processors of their own stolen materials. They remained dependent on the same exploitative middlemen who ensured the real profits flowed upward. Even successful tomb robbers who managed significant scores faced practical challenges in using their newfound wealth. Sudden prosperity in a society where most lived at subsistence level attracted dangerous attention. New clothes, better food, home improvements, any visible upgrade in lifestyle raised questions. Where did the money come from? How did a common laborer suddenly afford meat 3 times a week? Neighbors noticed. Officials investigated. The same poverty that drove people to rob tombs made it nearly impossible to enjoy the proceeds without scrutiny. The solution? Many tomb robbers lived in the same squalor as before, hiding their gains and spending them gradually over years. Some buried their proceeds, creating a different kind of tomb that sometimes remained undiscovered until modern times. Archaeological finds occasionally uncover these ancient savings accounts, caches of valuable items hidden by thieves who died before retrieving them. Even successful criminals often couldn't access their own wealth without risking exposure. The psychological burden of this continued poverty, despite significant risk, was crushing. Imagine breaking into a tomb, seeing treasures worth more than you could earn in 10 lifetimes, stealing as much as you can carry, and still struggling to feed your family months later. The contrast between the opulence you glimpsed underground and the squalor you returned to created a bitter cognitive dissonance. You had touched fabulous wealth, held it in your hands yet remained poor, a special kind of torment that legitimate laborers never experienced. For most tomb robbers, the enterprise became a subsistence trade rather than a path to advancement. They didn't rob tombs once and retire rich. They became career criminals making regular expeditions just to survive. Each foray added new risk of capture, curse, or betrayal. The odds worked against long-term survival in the profession. Historical records from tomb robbery trials reveal that most caught thieves had conducted multiple robberies over years, trapped in a dangerous cycle they couldn't escape. Some particularly clever tomb robbers attempted to break this cycle by establishing themselves as middlemen rather than frontline thieves. By connecting thieves with buyers, they could extract profits from others' risks while minimizing their own exposure. But this transition required connections, capital, and cunning that most desperate laborers lacked. The criminal economy, like its legitimate counterpart, maintained rigid class distinctions that were difficult to transcend. The diggers rarely became dealers. There were exceptions, infamous success stories that kept the dream alive and lured new desperate souls into the trade. The rare thief who discovered an overlooked cache successfully sold major items without excessive middleman cuts and managed to parlay the proceeds into legitimate business. These exceptional cases became legendary in criminal circles, whispered about like winning lottery tickets. The stonecutter from Abydos, who found the forgotten queen's jewelry and now owns farmland. The boatman who discovered a noble's tomb during a flood and opened a brewery. Hope is a powerful motivator, even when the odds make gambling look rational by comparison. Court records reveal that some tomb robbers attempted to form cooperatives to improve their economic position, sharing risks and profits while eliminating some middlemen. These primitive criminal syndicates rarely lasted long. The same desperate conditions that drove people to tomb robbing made sustainable cooperation difficult. Someone always got greedy, panicked, or turned informant when caught. Trust is a luxury that poverty seldom allows. The potentially higher profits of organized robbery remained theoretical for most thieves, who continued working in small, vulnerable groups. The sad economic reality extended beyond the thieves themselves to their families. Children of tomb robbers often inherited nothing but risk, knowledge of secret techniques, connections to dangerous associates, and the attention of suspicious authorities. The cycle of poverty continued across generations, with sons sometimes following fathers into tombs out of sheer necessity rather than choice. Criminal knowledge became a twisted family legacy when no legitimate opportunities existed for advancement. Women connected to tomb robbers faced particularly difficult circumstances. Wives rarely participated directly in robberies, but often helped conceal, transport, or sell stolen goods. When male robbers were caught and executed, their families sometimes faced guilt by association, eviction, ostracism, or formal punishment. Historical records mention widows of executed tomb robbers being reduced to begging after their husbands' crimes were discovered. The poverty that drove men into tombs became even more crushing for those they left behind. Some tomb robbers attempted to use their illicit proceeds to secure legitimate futures for their children, paying for apprenticeships, arranging marriages into respectable families, or purchasing small businesses. These efforts to convert sacrilege into social mobility rarely succeeded completely, but demonstrate that many thieves viewed their crimes as desperate means to conventional ends. They didn't want to be tomb robbers. They wanted what most humans seek: security, respect, and opportunity for their offspring. The tomb was merely the terrible path poverty forced them to walk. The most successful tomb robbers, financially speaking, were often those with the least personal risk: the corrupt officials who took bribes to overlook activity, the priests who inventoried tomb goods and skimmed valuable items, the noble-born tomb inspectors who discovered robberies and pocketed artifacts before reporting the crimes. These privileged criminals leveraged their positions to profit from others' desperate actions while maintaining their social standing. The rich got richer while the poor risked everything for scraps. Some economic principles transcend time. When archaeologists excavate ancient Egyptian settlements, they occasionally find valuable tomb goods in humble dwellings, objects that had no business being in a peasant's home. These artifacts tell silent stories of risk, desperation, and the rare successful thief who managed to keep some small treasure. A tiny golden amulet hidden beneath a simple home's floor, a semi-precious stone worked into an otherwise ordinary household item. These physical remnants of ancient crime remind us that while most tomb robbers remained poor, a few managed small victories against a system designed to keep wealth concentrated in death as it had been in life. Modern parallels exist in the illegal antiquities trade today. The local diggers in Egypt, Peru, or Cambodia, who actually unearth artifacts, receive a tiny fraction of the final sale price. The real profits go to smugglers, dealers, and collectors further up the chain, people who never get dirt under their fingernails or risk prison time at the excavation site. The exploitation of desperation remains remarkably consistent across millennia. Different tombs, same economic story. For all but the luckiest tomb robbers, the enterprise represented not a ladder out of poverty, but a desperate horizontal move, trading conventional poverty for a more dangerous version with occasional windfalls that never lasted. It was subsistence crime, not transformative theft. The golden treasures that seemed to promise escape from hardship delivered only temporary relief at permanent risk. Most tomb robbers lived poorly, died poorly, and left their families in the same crushing circumstances that had driven them underground in the first place. The final insult? When caught and executed, tomb robbers often had their own modest graves violated by the state. Authorities would disinter their remains and desecrate them as further punishment, denying them the very eternal rest they had denied others. Even in death, they remained the poorest of the poor, without the dignity of intact remains or funerary goods. The cycle of poverty and exploitation followed them beyond the grave, completing a bitter cosmic symmetry that would not have been lost on those who believed in Ma'at, the Egyptian concept of balance and justice. Perhaps this is the cruelest lesson of ancient tomb robbery. In a society of extreme inequality, even crime rarely offered true escape from one's station. The treasures of ancient Egypt, created through the labor of countless anonymous workers, remained largely inaccessible to their descendants, whether through legitimate means or theft. The gold that gleamed in royal tombs might briefly pass through a desperate robber's hands, but it inevitably flowed back toward those with power, leaving the thief as empty-handed as before. Different tomb, same story. The copper chisel has been replaced by the power drill. The flickering oil lamp has given way to the LED headlamp. The desperate peasant now carries a smartphone. But beneath these superficial changes, the essential story remains the same. Tomb robbery didn't end with the pharaohs. It simply evolved. Today's looters still crawl through the Egyptian sand by night, still driven by poverty, still feeding a global appetite for pieces of the past. The tools have changed, but the human equation remains eerily constant. Desperate people taking enormous risks to extract buried wealth for others to enjoy. The modern era of Egyptian tomb robbery began during Napoleon's 1798 expedition, when European interest in ancient artifacts exploded. Suddenly, wealthy collectors would pay handsomely for anything with hieroglyphics on it. Therefore, a new generation of tomb robbers emerged to meet this demand. But unlike their ancient predecessors, who melted down gold and discarded the rest, these thieves targeted precisely what earlier robbers had ignored: statues, inscriptions, papyri, and mummies themselves. The market had shifted from material value to historical value, but the exploitation remained. Technology transformed the scale and scope of tomb robbery. In the 1800s, dynamite allowed looters to blast through sealed chambers that had resisted ancient copper tools. The early 20th century brought jackhammers and motorized pumps to drain flooded tombs. By the 1970s, metal detectors could locate buried treasures with unprecedented precision. Each technological advance further tilted the balance away from preservation and toward plunder. Today's looters sometimes use ground-penetrating radar to identify promising sites before a single shovel touches dirt. The ancient cat-and-mouse game continues, only with much better mice. The international black market for Egyptian antiquities now operates with ruthless corporate efficiency. Like any global supply chain, it connects local producers, the diggers, to distributors, smugglers and dealers, to end consumers, collectors, and occasionally museums, through a complex network designed to maximize profit and minimize risk. A stone relief looted from a previously unknown tomb in Upper Egypt might pass through 7 countries and change hands a dozen times before reaching its final destination in a penthouse overlooking Central Park. Each transfer increases the price and obscures the object's true origin. The numbers are staggering. Experts estimate the illegal antiquities trade generates billions annually, with Egyptian artifacts among the most valuable. A well-preserved papyrus might fetch $50,000. A painted wooden coffin panel can sell for $500,000. A small but rare statue might command millions at private sale. Yet the Egyptian excavators, who take the greatest legal risks, digging illegally, often on their own property, typically receive less than 1% of these final values. The economic disparity that drove ancient tomb robbers persists in almost identical form today. Political instability has repeatedly created perfect conditions for accelerated looting. After the 2011 revolution that ousted Hosni Mubarak, Egypt experienced a catastrophic wave of archaeological theft. Police presence at major sites evaporated overnight. Guards went unpaid and abandoned posts. Organized criminal groups conducted industrial-scale excavations at previously protected sites. Satellite imagery shows entire landscapes transformed by thousands of looting pits dug during this period. The Arab Spring became a grave robber's gold rush, with decades of damage inflicted in months. Some modern tomb robbers operate with connections to terrorism and organized crime. Unlike their ancient counterparts who worked in small, local groups, today's looters sometimes function within sophisticated criminal networks that also traffic drugs, weapons, and humans. ISIS notoriously funded operations through antiquities looting in Syria and Iraq, establishing a pattern that Egyptian extremist groups have followed. The lonely, desperate thief driven by poverty has been joined by the calculating criminal driven by ideology. Both extract the past, but for different ends. Technology cuts both ways. While looters use advanced tools to find and extract artifacts, archaeologists and law enforcement employ satellite monitoring, database tracking, and DNA analysis to identify looted materials. Stolen artifacts now leave digital fingerprints as they move through international markets. Social media surveillance catches dealers inadvertently revealing illegally excavated items. The ancient cat-and-mouse game has moved partly online, with digital archaeologists hunting digital tomb robbers through virtual marketplaces where pharaonic treasures are sold alongside collectible sneakers and vintage watches. The human cost remains severe. Modern tomb robbers still die in collapsing tunnels, still suffer respiratory damage from tomb dust, still face harsh legal consequences if caught. Egypt's current laws impose prison sentences of 15 to 25 years for illegal excavation or trafficking of antiquities. Particularly significant cases can result in life imprisonment. Yet despite these deterrents, looting continues, driven by the same economic desperation that motivated thieves 3,000 years ago. When feeding your family today means risking your freedom tomorrow, many make the same choice their ancestors did. The ethical questions have grown only more complex. Museums worldwide contain Egyptian artifacts with questionable acquisition histories. The British Museum's Egyptian collection includes items removed during colonial rule. The Metropolitan Museum regularly faces questions about certain pieces in its Egyptian halls. Even university collections often contain objects that would not pass modern ethical standards for provenance. The tomb robber's shadow stretches across prestigious institutions that would prefer to forget how many of their treasures were initially extracted. Repatriation movements have gained momentum, with Egypt increasingly demanding the return of looted artifacts from foreign museums and collectors. Some institutions have responded by returning clearly stolen items, while others resist, citing concerns about preservation capabilities or legal ownership. The debate often centers on high-profile objects like the Rosetta Stone or the bust of Nefertiti, but thousands of lesser-known artifacts remain in dispute. Each contested piece carries the invisible fingerprints of looters, ancient or modern, who first removed it from Egyptian soil. The most tragic aspect of modern tomb robbery is its archaeological destruction. When looters target a previously undisturbed site, they destroy context that can never be recovered. A golden amulet tells one story when properly excavated, with its position documented, surrounding materials analyzed, and spatial relationships preserved. That same amulet looted and sold on the black market becomes merely a pretty object, its historical value fractured. Multiply this loss by thousands of sites and millions of artifacts, and the scale of lost knowledge becomes incalculable. Some Egyptian communities have remarkably complex relationships with tomb robbery. In villages near major archaeological sites, looting has sometimes continued through generations, creating a disturbing cultural inheritance where illegal excavation skills are passed from father to son. These communities often maintain dual consciousness, publicly supporting archaeological preservation while privately participating in looting when economic conditions deteriorate. Their relationship with the ancient past is simultaneously reverential and extractive, protective and exploitative. Digital technology has created entirely new forms of archaeological theft. High-resolution photographs of tomb paintings can be sold online without removing the physical artwork. 3D scanning allows the creation of perfect replicas that sometimes sell for nearly the price of originals. NFTs of Egyptian artifacts have emerged in cryptocurrency marketplaces, creating digital ownership claims over heritage items. The tomb robber's descendant might now operate with a camera rather than a chisel, but the fundamental act, converting cultural heritage into private profit, remains unchanged. Archaeologists and preservationists have developed innovative responses to modern looting. Community engagement programs offer economic alternatives to local populations near archaeological sites. Site guards are recruited from nearby villages, creating employment while leveraging local knowledge. Tourism revenue sharing gives communities financial stake in preservation rather than looting. These approaches acknowledge what has always been true. Tomb robbery is fundamentally an economic problem requiring economic solutions. Conservation archaeologists now regularly discover previously unknown tombs that show evidence of ancient robbery, followed by modern robbery, creating archaeological layers of theft separated by thousands of years. These sites tell a continuous story of extraction, with 21st century looters digging through the tunnels of their ancient predecessors. The circular nature of this history raises uncomfortable questions about whether our modern relationship with the past has truly evolved or merely adopted new technologies to serve old appetites. Perhaps the most profound legacy of tomb robbery, ancient and modern, is how it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about value, ownership, and cultural heritage. Who truly owns the artifacts of ancient Egypt? The modern Egyptian state, the global community, the descendants of those who created them, museums that have preserved them. These questions have no simple answers, but they all trace back to the fundamental disruption that occurred when the first desperate thief broke the seal on a tomb door and removed what was meant to remain buried forever. When tourists marvel at Egyptian artifacts in museums worldwide, they stand at the end of a chain that often began with theft, sometimes ancient, sometimes recent, sometimes clothed in colonial exploration, but theft nonetheless. The magnificently preserved tomb goods that allow us to understand ancient Egyptian civilization exist in our museums precisely because they were removed from their intended eternal resting places. Our archaeological knowledge is built partly on the foundation of what was essentially a crime, one committed repeatedly across thousands of years. This doesn't mean we shouldn't study, preserve, and appreciate these artifacts, but it does require acknowledging the complex, often exploitative pathways that brought them from tomb to display case. The golden death mask in the climate-controlled vitrine carries not just the face of an ancient ruler, but the invisible fingerprints of everyone who handled it after its original placement. including those who removed it through illicit means driven by poverty, greed, or colonial entitlement. As we conclude our journey through the desperate world of tomb robbers, from copper chisels to satellite imagery, from pharaonic curses to international law, one truth emerges clearly. The story of tomb robbery is inseparable from the story of Egyptology itself. Without looters, we would know far less about ancient Egypt. Yet because of looters, much of what we might have known is lost forever. This paradox defines our relationship with the ancient world, a relationship built on preservation and destruction, reverence and theft, science and crime. The tomb robber's legacy lives in every museum, every archaeology textbook, every discussion about cultural heritage and repatriation. Their desperate work, spanning millennia and driven by the most basic human needs, has shaped our understanding of the past in ways both constructive and destructive. They were not heroes. They were not villains. They were humans caught in systems of inequality that persist to this day, making impossible choices that continue to echo through history, museums, and the sandy excavation pits still being dug under cover of darkness along the Nile. You weren't a hero. You weren't even a successful criminal. You were just desperate, scared, and trapped between poverty and sacrilege. The gold that gleamed in your trembling hands wasn't worth the nightmares, the injuries, the betrayals, and the constant fear of horrible punishment. Your story wasn't the adventure depicted in films. It was a grim, choking struggle through darkness, driven by hunger and ending, more often than not, in misery. While kings and priests lived in luxury, you risked everything for scraps, breaking your body and soul in dark, airless tombs, surrounded by the dead who seemed to watch your every move. Your family never knew where you disappeared to on those nights. Your children never understood why you woke up screaming about darkness closing in. The weight of taboo and transgression followed you from the burial chamber back to your humble dwelling, a burden as heavy as any stone sarcophagus. The economics of your desperate trade ensured you remained poor despite touching unimaginable wealth. The golden treasures passed through your hands like water, leaving behind nothing but the residue of risk. The middlemen, the dealers, the corrupt officials, they grew fat on your labor while you continued scraping for survival. Even when you succeeded, you failed. The cosmic joke of tomb robbery was that it rarely provided escape from the poverty that drove you to it in the first place. Your body paid the price for your sacrilege, eyes strained from perpetual darkness, lungs scarred from ancient dust, joints broken from crawling through spaces never meant for the living. The physical toll accumulated with each expedition, not in dramatic injuries, but in the slow, grinding deterioration that transformed you into an old man while still in your prime. Your hands, once nimble enough to untie the delicate knots of mummy wrappings, eventually twisted into claws that struggled to hold a cup. The psychological burden was worse. Dreams of pursuing mummies, of collapsing passages, of awakening gods. The constant fear of discovery that made you flinch at every unexpected knock. The complicated guilt of violating your own cultural taboos, while simultaneously resenting the system that made such violation necessary. You lived in two worlds, the everyday village life of family and community, and the shadow existence of the tomb, where different rules applied and different gods watched. Most tomb robbers died as they lived, in poverty, pain, and fear. Whether from a trap, a betrayal, or the executioner's blade, few found the escape they were looking for. Those who survived carried the weight of their deeds, and perhaps the curse of the disturbed dead, to their own graves. After a lifetime of violating others' eternal rest, your own burial would likely be hasty, unmarked, and possibly desecrated in turn. The symmetry would not have been lost on you. In the history books, you're just a villain, a desecrator of sacred spaces. Archaeological reports mention you as an unfortunate footnote. Evidence of ancient looting was found in the Western Chamber. Museum placards describing priceless artifacts rarely acknowledge that their journey from tomb to display case began with your desperate hands. You are the inconvenient truth of Egyptology, simultaneously essential to and erased from the narrative. But in truth, You were caught in the gears of a society that left you with impossible choices. The treasures of Egypt were never meant for people like you. They were sealed away with the dead, while the living starved. The pharaohs who commissioned magnificent tombs filled with riches never imagined those riches would feed desperate families thousands of years later. Yet in their determination to bring their wealth into the afterlife, they created the very conditions that guaranteed their eternal rest would be disturbed. You weren't remembered in hieroglyphics or honored in stone, but your desperate gambles, your terrified crawls through narrow passages, and your sacrilegious hands shaped Egyptian history as surely as any pharaoh. Because in the end, it wasn't the curses that emptied the tombs of Egypt, it was human desperation. Not mystical retribution, but the mundane reality of hunger, need, and survival. The tomb robber's legacy is etched into every aspect of how we understand ancient Egypt. The hidden Valley of the Kings exists because previous royal burial sites were too vulnerable to robbery. The elaborate burial practices, fake chambers, and mummy caches all evolved in response to the persistent threat you represented. Even our modern understanding of Egyptian religion, art, and culture comes partly through objects brought to light not by careful archaeology, but by illicit excavation. Your shadowy work shaped both ancient security practices and modern Egyptology. And that might be the real curse, one that has followed humanity through every age and civilization. While some feast, others are driven to terrible acts just to survive. Even in death, the powerful remained powerful, and the desperate remained desperate. The treasures were never really yours to take, but neither were they truly theirs to keep forever. The pharaohs who believed they could defy time and mortality by sealing their wealth underground discovered, through your hands, the limits of their power. This pattern continues today. The modern tomb robber with his metal detector and smartphone is your direct descendant, driven by the same economic forces, feeding the same human appetite for possessing pieces of the past. The wealthy collector displaying a looted artifact in a Manhattan penthouse stands at the end of a chain of exploitation that begins with desperate hands digging in Egyptian soil, just as it did 5,000 years ago. Perhaps the most important lesson from your grim life is how little has changed. The specifics evolve. Copper tools become power drills, oil lamps become flashlights, local sale becomes international smuggling. But the fundamental human equation remains the same. Extreme inequality creates desperate measures. Sacred boundaries fall before basic needs. What was buried will eventually be uncovered, whether by officially sanctioned archaeology or midnight excavation. As museum visitors marvel at the golden treasures of ancient Egypt, few think about you, the nameless individuals who first brought many of these objects back into the light, driven not by scholarly interest but by hunger. Yet your fingerprints remain, invisible but present, on countless artifacts that now educate and inspire millions. In your desperate search for subsistence, you accidentally preserved history, even as you violated it. The story of tomb robbery isn't just about theft. It's about who controls the past, who has access to heritage, and how inequality shapes our relationship with history itself. It reminds us that archaeology and looting have uncomfortable shared origins, and that our neatly organized museum displays emerged from processes far messier than the explanatory placards suggest. You weren't heroes. You weren't adventurers. You were the hungry, the desperate, the forgotten. Yet in your crude tunnels and midnight excavations, you shaped our understanding of the past as surely as any archaeologist. The gleaming treasures of ancient Egypt, now admired in climate-controlled display cases worldwide, passed first through your unwashed, trembling hands. Hands that reached into the darkness not for knowledge or preservation, but simply to survive another day in the shadow of the pyramids.